Howdy, howdy, y'all. Today is Wednesday, November 3rd. Same as it ever was. We are on to our muscle physiology. We've been building up. Like I said, we finished everything with a single muscle cell, and we'll now start putting muscle cells together in today's class and just continuing to build upward with our muscle physiology. In lab today, we'll continue our origins, insertions, and actions. We'll finish off the arm and then start the leg, which we'll then finish on Monday. You have 2 assignments due on Monday, your Unit 11 review and the muscle activity handout that is due. Again, remember that is graded for correctness. All leading up to 1 week from today. So this weekend is your big study weekend because 1 week from today is your lab and lecture exam on this material. Then you have a nice 5-day weekend, and during that 5-day weekend, I want you thinking about the nervous system. So to help you prepare for the nervous system, you have 2 pre-labs that are going to be due. Again, not the reviews, the pre-labs at the beginning of the lab sections, and those are for units 12 and 13. And I'll remind you about that again next week, and then also obviously after the exam, you'll get a announcement from Canvas about that as well. All righty. Questions on that? Again, the closer we get to the exam, the simpler the schedule gets. So any questions on that before we dive back into the material? All righty then. As I mentioned last week, or last class, we pretty much learned everything you ever wanted to know and more about a single muscle cell. So now we are going to put muscle cells together into groups. Because again, if our goal is to change the amount of tension, so I can lift this pen, or I can lift this phone, or I can lift this book, or I can lift this chair, we want to stimulate different numbers of muscle cells. To stimulate different numbers of muscle cells, we use what is called a motor unit. A motor unit is that somatic motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it innervates. Now here we have this, but let's go to the whiteboard and do a really simple example of this. Oops, whoa, didn't mean to do that. There we go. Let's say, for instance, we have a fascicle that has 6 muscle cells in it. Not all of the muscle cells in here are going to be controlled by a single somatic motor neuron. There will be different numbers. So for instance, we'll have a red motor unit. We'll call that motor unit A. As we know, it's got a cell body, it's got its little processes that come off those dendrites, and it has a single axon that comes off and can synapse on, forming that neuromuscular junction with a muscle cell. However, one of the important things to remember about somatic motor neurons is they are not limited to just forming one synapse on one muscle cell. Remember, their axon is unbranching, but as we talked about, at the end of that axon, there are axon terminals where it can branch and it can allow it to communicate with more than one muscle cell. And we'll throw a green one on here as well. With a single axon that branches. So notice what's happening here. Each muscle cell gets one and only one neuromuscular junction. Basically, it gets input from only one somatic motor neuron. However, each somatic motor neuron can communicate with many skeletal muscle cells. It's kind of like the Army. In the Army, each soldier has one general that is in charge of them. However, a general can be in charge of thousands of men. And that's basically what we see here as well. So we have these three motor units: motor unit A, motor unit B, and motor unit C. And notice the advantage of this is that these motor units are of different sizes. So let's do some really simple math. Let's say that one muscle cell is able to generate enough force to lift 1 pen. So if this fascicle was the only fascicle that was in my bicep brachia and I wanted to flex my elbow and lift this pen, which motor unit would I use? There you go. I just got it. Motor unit A. What if I wanted to lift 2 pens?
A and B.
Well, do I need to use A and B? A and B, if I used A and B together, wouldn't that give me 3 muscle cells worth of force?
Just B.
Just B, exactly. If I use just B, that will allow me to lift 2. What if I want to lift 3?
That would be C.
Yeah, then I could use C. What if I wanted to lift 4?
It would be B and, well, that complicates it, right?
A little bit. So
It'd be
up.
C and A.
Oh, yes, DNA.
C and A, absolutely. C and A would allow me to do that. What if I wanted to lift
Apparently.
5?
C and B.
C and B. What if I wanted to lift 6?
A, B, C.
Yeah. And what if I wanted to lift 7?
No.
Yeah, then I'm screwed, right? I can't. Exactly. Absolutely. Excellent. Notice the advantage of having these different size motor units is I'm able to modify and adjust how much force I'm able to produce to lift the load precisely that I want to lift. And we're usually pretty good about this, right? As you go to lift an object, you're able to produce enough force to lift it up. Although you do get tricked every once in a while. There may be that really huge box on the table that you go to grab and it turns out it's completely empty. And so you practically throw it into space as you pick it up. Or maybe your wife has put 14 cans into a plastic bag that is on the counter that you weren't aware of there. So you go to try to lift it up and then you kind of stumble with it because it weighed more than you expected, right? But we're usually pretty good at being able to adjust and modify these motor units to be able to do the amount of work we want them to do. And so having different size motor units are going to allow us to do different amounts of work. The other important rule to remember about our motor units is that when a motor unit fires, or let's say it this way, when a somatic motor neuron all of the cells it communicates with fire, contract, and relax together. So they all work together as one unit. Which is why it's called a motor unit, because they're all going to work together as one. All right. Notice here you see the beginning of that. Here we see some muscles, cells in a fascicle, and some motor neurons that are communicating with them. And again, they're going to work together as a single unit. Now, in your body, the average size of a motor unit is one somatic motor neuron talking to 150 muscle cells. However, that's also kind of like saying that the average height of a male is 5'9" or 5'10", whatever it is. Let's say it's 5'10". 5'10" is the average height of a male. Is that necessarily a meaningful number?
No.
No, because there's a huge range of heights. So yes, mathematically, there is an average, a place in the middle, but it isn't necessarily a meaningful number because there's a ton of people that are taller and a ton of people that are shorter. So it isn't necessarily a meaningful number. And the same is true here. Yes, there is a mathematical average, but there are very differing size motor units. Remember before, when we were talking about trying to thread that needle, when you're trying to thread that needle doing a very precise movement, there may be a motor unit that communicates with as few as 4 muscle cells, right? Some of the precise facial expressions we're able to make have very, very small motor units. However, if you're trying to kick that 50-yard field goal to win the football game at the end, you want a hugely powerful motor unit where a single somatic motor cell communicates with thousands of muscle cells, right? You're not going to get a tremendous amount of precision with that, but you're going to get a major, massive amount of force, allowing you to kick that football half the distance of the football field. So different size motor units allow for different strengths of activities. Now, also, like I drew it, and like we see here in this illustration, most of the fascicles contain motor units, multiple motor units, and those motor units are intermingled. Notice you're not seeing, for instance, that all the purple cells for the purple motor are over here, and all the red are over here, and all the blue are over here. Instead, they're intermixed together. What's the advantage of having them intermixed together?
More communication, like when we're trying to get all of the muscle fibers active.
Okay, I like that. Absolutely. You're right in that that will provide better coordination when we're getting them to work together. But the other thing, it also helps to distribute the strength and the direction of the movement as well. Absolutely. So notice if just the purple or just the blue or just the red motor units fire individually, you're going to get the exact same action within that fascicle. Whereas if all the muscles were on one side of a fascicle, you might get a slightly different action maybe, or something like that. So having them intermingled helps to distribute the strength, helps to, coordinate it. And notice else something interesting about these three motor units. Unlike the one I drew earlier, how many purple muscle cells are in motor unit 3?
7.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. How many are in the red one?
6.
And how many are in the blue one?
7.
Notice, unlike the drawings we've seen before, for the most part, these fascicles, these motor units are similar in size. What's the advantage of something like that? Why would I want in this fascicle to have motor units that use the same amount of muscle cells and so can generate the same amount of force?
So that when you're not using all of them, it's still like an equal.
True. Okay, that's part of it. We want to go beyond that. Let's say, for instance, I want to lift 7 pens, and I want to continue to hold them out here in space. If I'm going to continue to hold these pens out here in space, am I going to want to just continuously fire the red motor unit over and over and over again, just using those red muscle cells to keep this up forever, or at least for as long as I can keep those Exactly, to avoid fatigue. The advantage of this is I can switch. I can go from the red to the purple to the blue, and by switching between them, I'm able to let it reduce fatigue. I'm able to avoid fatigue and keep this up for a prolonged period of time. Rather than just relying on 7 muscle cells to keep this up, I can switch between the motor units and they will be able to stave off fatigue, and I can produce a steady amount of force for a prolonged period of time. Excellent, excellent, excellent. All right. There's one other important rule to understand about motor units is that not all motor units get stimulated at the same time. This is important for a process called recruitment. Oh, I got to get rid of all of my dots. With recruitment, I'm adding more and more motor units together to be able to produce more and more force. Notice here we have a fascicle that has different motor units within it. And when you have a fascicle with different motor units, typically the smallest motor units are the ones that get stimulated first. They are the ones that are easiest to excite. So there is some bag on the table that has some random number of pens in it that I don't know how many they are. So when I grab and start to try to lift that bag, the very first fascicle that, the very first motor unit that is going to get stimulated is going to be the smallest. Notice it's this one with the 2 muscle cells in it. And that produces a very small amount of tension. Now, if this 2-cell motor unit isn't enough to be able to lift that bag, then I can add a second motor unit to it, the next smallest, which happens to be this one that has 3 muscle cells in it. I now have 5 muscle cells firing, and I generate some more tension. Notice if that's not enough, there's that one, there's that one, there's that one, there and there. Then I can stimulate the next motor unit. Notice this one has 4 muscle cells in it, or 5. And I get more tension. And then I add another motor unit until I am stimulating all the motor units in that fascicle. At that point, all the muscle cells are stimulated, contracting and relaxing together. And I produce the maximal tension that I can with that one fascicle. So I keep adding bigger and bigger motor units until I'm at the maximal tension when I'm firing all the muscle cells together. And as we just finished talking about, if all the muscle cells are firing together, am I going to be able to alternate through them to reduce fatigue?
No.
No. So if I'm firing all of them at the same time, these muscle cells are going to fatigue much more rapidly. So this maximal contraction is typically not something I'm going to be able to do for a long period of time, right? So I can hold those pens or my phone out here in space for, practically ever, right? If I'm trying to hold a pen, a single pen out in space, really it's my arm is the weight that I have to worry about more than the pen. So I can pretty much hold this out here forever. But am I able to hold my couch out here forever?
No.
No, absolutely not, because the more weight, the more muscle cells you have to fire together, the quicker they will fatigue. All right. And again, notice here, erase my drawings. We see how that alternating firing, that asynchronous firing between the motor units can help to produce a sustained contraction for a longer period of time. And like we talked about, it can help to reduce the fatigue of the muscles. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. All right. Now that we know how to get these muscle cells to fire together to produce our tension, we can start talking about how that tension affects the entire muscle, moving the muscle through space. We kind of talked about this a little bit before. While you're sitting here in your chair, your muscles of your legs are in a relaxed state. However, as we also talked about, if I were to roll a paraplegic into your room right now, and you were to poke your leg and you were to poke their leg, would it feel the same?
No.
No. And the reason for that is while your muscles in your legs may quote unquote be relaxed, there is still muscle tone within those muscles. There is a partially sustained contraction in that relaxed muscle. It helps to stabilize the joints. It can help to move in the circulation of the blood back towards the heart. It can have the muscle in a state of being prepared to contract, right? It can help you balance your equilibrium, things along those lines. Whereas that paraplegic has absolutely, because of spinal cord damage, no neural input to their legs. So their legs are completely flaccid, that flaccid paralysis that we talked about. So even when a muscle is relaxed, there is still a partial contraction in it. There's still muscle tone within them. However, that's not really what we consider a full contraction. When we contract the muscles, right, there are two ways we can contract the muscles. And actually, let's do this on the whiteboard. As you know, I have great disdain for chemistry. Nothing good has ever come from chemistry. But physics, on the other hand, is a very vitally important science. So our first type of muscle contraction is an isotonic contraction. There is a lot in a name. What does iso mean? Anyone know what iso means?
Equal.
Yeah, equal or same. And tonic refers to tone or tension. So this is a contraction where the tension that is produced in the muscle stays the same. Or does not change, let's say it that way. Right. That kind of makes sense. If my goal is to lift this pen, does the weight of this pen change as I move it from here to here to here to here to here? No. So the whole time I'm lifting it, if I'm going to lift it, I need to be using the same amount of tension, the same amount of force for that entire contraction. So with an isotonic contraction, the tension of the contraction does not change. And let's put that in capitals. However, notice that while the tension, let's say it this way, the tension in the muscle does not change as I am lifting that pen. But notice that the shape of the muscle does change. So again, as I am flexing my elbow to move that pen, the weight of the pen, the force of the load, that's basically what that is, doesn't change, so the amount of force I have to produce does not change as well. However, as I do it, the shape of the muscle does change. So the muscle changes length. And really, I guess that's probably a better way to say it. The length of the muscle does not change. Now, the reason for this, and again, the units of tension don't matter. So let's call them Slutskys. If this pen requires 1 Slutsky of force to move it through space, can I move it through space by just producing 1 Slutsky of force with my muscle? No. So notice in this case, to move a load, the force must not equal the load. So the force has always got to be different. The force or the tension I produce cannot be equal to the load. And I don't know how to make a not equal, so I'll cheat and do it that way. Oh, let's do it. There, there. The tension cannot be equal to the load. And that allows the muscle to change length. And again, perfect example is me flexing my elbow to move this pen. Or me grabbing the bag of groceries out of the car and lifting them up. Now, do I continue to lift that bag of groceries up the entire time that I'm walking into the house?
No.
No, I lift the groceries up, and I'm sure like you do, I always carry my groceries out at arm's length. And so while I'm carrying the groceries into the house with my arm out at fully extended, abducted like this as I'm carrying out my groceries at full length, is my muscle changing shape anymore while I'm carrying those groceries?
No.
No. So notice this is a different type of contraction. This type of contraction is what we call an isometric. Iso means what?
Same.
Yeah, it still means same. And in this case, metric refers to length. So with an isometric contraction, the length of the muscle does not change. Oops. During the contraction. Now, I've grabbed those bags of groceries. I've grabbed 2 bags of groceries. I've picked them up and I've got them out here and I'm ready to carry them into the house. And then my wife comes and puts 2 more bags of groceries onto my arm. What happens when that occurs?
Unbalanced in one arm.
So when she puts 2 more bags of groceries on my arm, does my arm start to go down now because of the added weight?
Yes, it adducts.
No, because if it does, then she wins and I can't let her win. So when she puts more weight onto my arm, what happens?
Oh, you contract more tension?
I put more tension into it so that it stays exactly where it is, right? Or maybe my kids take pity on me. They don't, but let's pretend they do. One comes and grabs one of the bags off of my arm. When she grabs one of the bags off of my arm, does my arm suddenly go flying into space?
No.
No. So notice with an isometric contraction, the length doesn't change, but the amount of tension produced can change. And the reason for this is to stabilize that muscle in place, the force produced must always be equal to the load. So in this case, the tension, must equal the load. If the load changes, I have to change the tension. I have to change the force that it's making so that they always are equal. All right. Questions on that?
Yes, for isotonic contractions, you said the shape stays the same but not length?
No, I notice I changed it. I changed it to length. When we talk about the shape of a muscle, we talk about its length. But you're right. It is more accurate to say length. So if you notice, I did go back and change length.
Okay, so that the shape stays the same.
Well, I mean, when it changes length, its shape is changing.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So
Okay.
it's not wrong to say that its shape changes, but it's more accurate to say that its length changes.
The length changes. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's more important. All right.
Thank you.
All right. You guys with me so far?
Yeah.
All right. So let's take this one step further. I lift the bags up out of the shopping bags out of the back of my car. What type of contraction was that?
Isotonic.
Isotonic. I then hold them in place while I walk into the house. What type of contraction is that?
Isometric.
Excellent. And then when I get to the kitchen table, what do?
You put them down.
Right. And do I do that by just relaxing the muscle and letting the bags fall to the table?
No.
No. Because that's going to smash the eggs. So instead, I need to put them down in a controlled fashion. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. So you can do this at home. What I want you to do is pretend you're lifting a really heavy weight and flex your elbow. And as you're flexing your elbow, where are you feeling the tension in that? Do you feel that in the bicep brachia or do you feel that in the tricep brachia?
Bicep brachia.
Yeah, bicep brachia. At the same time, I want you to think like if you're doing those curls for the girls, and again, not like the guys in the gym do it, right? They use all this energy to lift the weight up and then they just relax and let it fall down. That's not how you're supposed to do it, right? That's how you break the eggs of the groceries. I want you to lower, extending that arm, lowering that weight. As you're doing that, where do you feel the tension? Do you feel the tension in the tricep brachia or the bicep brachia while you're lowering that weight?
Tricep.
Do you really feel it in the tricep? Do it again.
Your bicep.
You're actually feeling it in the bicep. When you are lowering that weight down to the table, you're actually using the bicep brachia for that. Notice with an isotonic contraction, I said that the length of the muscle changes, but I didn't say that it shortens because there are sometimes there is one type of isotonic contraction where the muscle gets shorter. But there is also, let's do it this way so I have room to play. A isotonic contraction where the muscle gets longer. So there are actually two types of isotonic contractions. So in our isotonic contractions, we have first what is called, hey, well, here, let's do it this way. So again, our isotonic contraction, the tension of the muscle does change. The tension of the muscle stays the same, but it does change the length of the muscle. Isometric contractions, where the tension of the muscle does not change, but the muscle length does change. We have concentric and eccentric contractions. A concentric contraction is where the muscle shortens during the contraction. And the eccentric is where the muscle lengthens during the contraction. So let's go back to our whiteboard and think about this. Concentric contractions are the ones where the muscle gets shorter. While contracting. The question becomes why? What are we doing here that is causing the muscle to get shorter while we contract?
Like flexing.
True, this is going to be during the flex, absolutely. But remember, we want to think of this in terms of physics. What is the relationship of the tension to the load when I am doing a concentric contraction? All right, the tension, excellent. The tension that I'm producing, the force that I'm producing has to be bigger than the load. If I have 2 pens in my hand, then I need to produce 3 Slutsky's worth of force to lift them up. The force I'm producing has to be greater than the load. And in that way, the muscle gets shorter. On the other hand, with the eccentric contraction, this is where the muscle gets longer during the contraction. Why?
Because the tension is less than the load.
There you go. Right? If I have these 2 pens and I want to put them down on the table, I could, of course, just put the tension in my muscle as 0, in which case my hand would relax and just fall to the ground. But like I said, if instead of carrying pens, I'm carrying a dozen eggs, that's not a good way to do that. So if I put just 1 Slutsky of tension into my arm, the 2 of my pens are going to lower it down. They're going to force it down, but in a more controlled fashion. Now, from what we learned about how a muscle contracts with that myosin head grabbing and pulling on the actin, how can myosin be contracting and pulling on the actin and the muscle getting longer? How is that possible that can occur? Well, let's think of it this way. 18 of us here in the classroom, me on one side, all 17 of you on the other, and we're playing tug of war. You think about it, tug of war is pretty much exactly like how the muscle works. You grab the rope, you pull the rope, you let go of the rope, you reach out to grab again. So, and they alternate like the myosin heads. Grab, pull, let go, extend. Grab, pull, let go, and I'm doing that. As we're playing tug of war, and I'm grabbing and pulling on my side, and all 17, now 18 of you are pulling on the other side, what's going to happen? I grab and pull the rope, and then all 18 of you pull on the other side, and what's going to happen?
You're going to fly forward.
Yeah, my arms are going to be jerked forward, or the rope is going to slide through my hands, giving me rope burn. So I'm still grabbing and pulling, but the rope is still going that way because you guys are winning. Now, is that going to be very easy on the myosin heads to have the actin being yanked away from them? No. So notice this is a very impactful contraction on the muscle cells. This one is much more fatiguing. If, because you got the weekend coming up, you decide to go to New York for the weekend. Back in ancient times, when you went to New York for the weekend, you could decide on a whim that you wanted to go climb to the top of the Statue of Liberty. The view up there is truly stunning. Now, of course, you have to, apply for a pass to be able to get up there and everything else. And I haven't even thought about what happens now with COVID. But back in ancient times, if you wanted to go, you could just take the boat across and you could climb to the top. The problem is, even though it's a spectacular view, there's no elevator to get to the top. It's stairs, something like 3,000 stairs. So you have to walk up 3,000 stairs to see the view, and then you have to walk down 3,000 stairs afterwards. And after going to the top of the Statue of Liberty, how do your legs feel the next day? How do your quadricep muscles feel the next day?
Sore.
They're really sore. And guess what? Your quadriceps aren't sore from climbing up the stairs. Your quadriceps are actually sore from coming down the stairs. Because if you think about the way your leg, if this is your knee, when you're going down the stairs, you are actually extending the quadricep muscle as you are going down the stairs. So you're actually contracting the quadricep muscle, but it is extending as you're doing that. So walking downstairs is an eccentric contraction in your quadricep muscle, and it's much more impactful and it's much more fatiguing that way as well. All right. So we talked about, so when you're doing that weightlifting, again, that's also why, again, it's so funny when you watch these guys in the gym doing their bicep curls. They have this massive amount of weight and they work so hard to get that weight up. And then as soon as they get the weight up, they just relax the arms and let the weight fall down. Is that the best way to work out the muscle to get the effect that they want? No, it is much better to reduce it in that, to let it down in that controlled state. As you're letting it down in that controlled state, you're doing a much more impactful contraction of your bicep muscle, and you're going to get bigger muscles from that more controlled descent. That doesn't mean you can't use isometric contractions to work out. We talked about the example of holding it on, but there's a whole series of muscle contraction or muscle activities, exercises, where you do things like you push against your own self or you pull against your own self. Notice as I'm pulling on my two arms, I can pull with a little bit of tension or I can pull with a lot of tension. But notice as I change the amount of tension, my arms don't change length. It's the same thing if you do some of these isometric contractions against a wall. I push against the wall, and no matter how hard I push against that wall, is the wall going anywhere?
No.
No. So my muscles aren't changing length, and whether I put a little bit of force or a whole lot of force into it, that wall's not going anywhere. So again, isometric contractions can also be used for workout. It is also a very effective workout method, but it's all about either keeping the tone, the strength, the tension, the load in the muscle the same, or keeping the length of the muscle the same. Now, isometric contractions are good for those exercises, are good for holding up bags of groceries. What else do those isometric contractions where the muscle stays the same length do for us? One of those things we take for granted until something like last Sunday night on Halloween, where you had one too many candy apples. And by candy apples, I don't mean the things on the end of the stick. I mean hard cider with a Fireball in it.
Oh, balance?
Yeah, maintaining posture. If you think about maintaining posture, the goal in the muscles of your core are to stay the same length, right? You have to constantly adjust the tension so that you stay here. And it's actually a really challenging thing to do. We take it for granted how complicated this process is until it gets impaired by too many candy apples. Then suddenly you're a little bit more wobbly and you're not quite as good at those isometric contractions, maintaining that posture, maintaining those joints, right? All righty, excellent. Questions on that? So again, these eccentric are more forceful contractions and therefore more fatiguing. And that's where we have to go next. Before we can talk about fatigue, though, we need to talk about where we're going to produce our energy for these contractions. Let me see where we're at right now. All right, it is a little bit early, but this is a good natural stopping point. So let's go ahead and, even though it's a teeny bit early, let's go ahead and take our first break here. Because then we can talk about the energy for contraction and then fatigue and then recovery all at once. We don't have to break that up. So I think that makes a little bit more sense to do that this way. So let's go ahead and take our first break here. We'll take a 15-minute break, which means coming back at 9:01. Restart, and I will start the recording at that time. All right, so any questions on the types of contractions before we take our break? All right, then I will see you guys in 15 minutes. All righty. We now know how to produce contractions. We know how the muscle cell is going to work. We know how to coordinate those muscle cells together using our motor units. And we know the types of contractions we can make, producing tension and either stabilizing or moving our muscles through space. But one of the important things to remember are what are the two primary things that must be inside the cell for a muscle contract or for a muscle to contract. What are the two things you must have?
Myosin and actin.
True.
ATP.
Okay, that is correct. But I was thinking more from free-floating molecules, and Mitch has actually got it. Calcium and ATP. Now, as we know, is calcium used up during the contraction?
No.
No. We know that it binds to the troponin, changes the shape of the troponin, and then lets go of the troponin. And so it bounces around. So it's about whether it's been released into the cytosol or removed into the cytosol. But ATP is used up. So one of the primary limiting factors in how long we can contract a muscle is how much ATP is available to sustain that contraction. Now, as it turns out, there are four primary ways that we can get the energy needed for a muscle to contract. When my bicep brachia here is sitting here in its relaxed state and I suddenly start to contract it, where is the ATP coming from for that contraction?
The axon?
Say again?
The axon? Like the terminal?
Well, again, remember, we're talking about in the muscle cell. So we're in the muscle cell.
Oh, inside.
The mitochondria.
True. Okay. But if you think about it, when a muscle is in a relaxed state, is there ATP already readily available inside the muscle cell to be able to be used?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we first start contracting a muscle, we're able to use that stored ATP. ATP is like money, right? You have 20 bucks in your pocket. And if you run into something that you need to spend money on, you have that money readily available right there, ready to use. Right? Even when a muscle is in a relaxed state, we know that there are pumps, there are other metabolic activities that are going to need ATP. So there is always ATP readily available inside of the cytoplasm. So this is just free ATP in the cytosol. Now, as I mentioned, there are pumps and there are other things that use ATP. So is there going to be a massive amount of stored ATP just floating around inside of the cell?
No.
No. Do you want to be walking around with $3,000 just sitting in your pocket?
I mean, some of us might.
I guess it depends on, yeah, it depends on what you did last night, but absolutely. Typically you don't want to have that kind of money sitting around inside your pocket. So not surprisingly, if we were going to contract a muscle and just rely on the free floating ATP that was inside the cell, we would only be able to contract that muscle for 2 to 10 seconds. And is that what happens? You can only contract a muscle for 10 seconds and then it just stops?
No.
No. So while this is easy and readily available, we need another source. And for this, I'm going to switch actually to the whiteboard for this. So our sources of energy for a muscle contraction. First is just, oops, stored ATP. Right, this is just ATP that is free floating. But as I mentioned, just like having a lot of cash on hand is a bad thing, having a lot of ATP in the cell can be a bad thing as well, because ATP affects a lot of things, a lot of pumps, a lot of other processes. So luckily for us, we have a second energy molecule. And that second energy molecule is called creatine phosphate.
Do you have a 1 by it on purpose or?
Nope, no, I do not. I have it because I'm not good at talking and typing at the same time. Excellent. Our second is creatine phosphate. Creatine is a special protein that is produced and stored in the muscle cell. And what creatine is able to do is if it sees a free-floating ATP just hanging out inside of the cell, it can go to that ATP and rip off its phosphate. It will actually split the ATP. And when it splits the ATP, like pumps and all those other things, when it splits the ATP, even the myosin head, when it splits the ATP, it takes that energy and uses that energy to do work. But that's not what creatine does. Creatine actually stores the energy. So when it comes across that ATP, it grabs off that phosphate, it becomes creatine phosphate. And of course, the ATP becomes ADP. Now, when the cell is at rest, there is lots of free-floating ATP floating around. And so what happens is that drives this chemical reaction to the right. So we get lots of creatine phosphate. And then, of course, this ADP can go back to the mitochondria to get a new phosphate, and we can make more ATP while it's there. However, when we start to exercise, when we start to contract the muscle, the amount of ADP rise in the cell. And when the ADP rises in the cell, that actually reverses the chemical reaction. And now what happens is our creatine phosphate, which I'm just going to abbreviate CP right here, is going to find an ADP, and it's going to give it that phosphate back. And when it gives it that phosphate back, it makes it into an ATP. So basically what creatine phosphate really does is it just stores energy in a safe, stable form. Again, we go back to the cash analogy. This is your checking account. Rather than walking around with $3,000 in your pocket, you can have $3,000 safely in your checking account. But if you need some of that money to buy that new pair of shoes or that new sweatshirt or whatever it is, right? You have your card or you have your checkbook where you can get that stored money if you need it. And that's basically what creatine phosphate is. This is a stored energy. And as I mentioned, it is a more stable form of stored energy. So the cell typically has somewhere around 3 times as much creatine phosphate as ATP floating around when it is at rest. What that means is if with just ATP alone, we could make a contraction that lasts 2 to 10 seconds. Here with creatine phosphate, we could make a contraction that could last as much as 30 seconds. Now, again, a 30-second contraction is a really useful contraction. But is that all I want to be able to contract my body for? 30 seconds and boom, that's it?
No.
No. So while both of these first two types are stored energy, once we use up that stored energy, then we have to make new energy. Once we've spent that 20 bucks we have in our pocket, once we've spent that 3,000 we have in our checking account, we got to get a job. We got to make new money. And so once we have used up all of our store formed of energy, now we need to be able to make money. But the good news is we have two ways that we can do that. One, as you guys already pointed out, uses the mitochondria. This process of using the mitochondria to make ATP is what we call aerobic. Oops.
Yeah.
Respiration. This uses the mitochondria, and it uses the mitochondria, or let's say it this way, it occurs in the mitochondria. And what is the equation for this? What's going on with aerobic respiration? What's happening in the mitochondria? What is the mitochondria doing to make us new energy?
It breaks down glucose.
Excellent. So we have a sugar like glucose, and we are breaking it down. However, in the mitochondria, to break that sugar down completely, what do we need?
Oxygen?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. And when we use that oxygen to break the sugar down completely, as a result of that, we get a ton of energy. And that energy can be used to make ATP. But there are two byproducts, two waste products. What are the two waste products of this chemical reaction?
CO2?
Carbon dioxide and
Water.
water. There you go, exactly. This is an incredibly efficient process. From this, one single glucose can be broken down completely to make how many ATP?
32.
It actually, it's the net is somewhere closer to 32 to 36 ATP. It's not an exact number, but it's in that range. It is an incredibly efficient process. All right. And so because of this, you can sustain activities for a very long period of time. How long can you stand for?
Hours.
Yeah, pretty much ever. Exactly. But notice the key word there. I said moderate activities. I said standing. You can stand for hours. How long can you sprint for? Okay, true. Maybe not at 7 months pregnant, you can't stand for hours. That is true. But how long can you sprint for?
I don't know. An hour or two.
You can
Feel like-
sprint. I'm not talking about like jogging. I'm talking about
Like,
sprinting.
At a minute, maybe.
Yeah, I'm saying like bear with an axe chasing you sprinting. How long can you do that for?
Maybe a minute.
Yeah,
Maybe.
not definitely hours at that point. If there is a downside to this process of aerobic respiration, it's that it's a relatively slow process. And because of that, it is not able to make enough energy for a maximal intensity contraction. In fact, it can only make about 1/3 of the energy necessary, for instance, to be able to sprint. Does that
So
mean
why,
that
like, people can drink like protein shakes or those does that make you have more ATP, like where you have more energy, you can have more endurance and last longer? Is there a way to increase the aerobic respiration, I guess?
there are some ways to do that? Yeah, absolutely. Let's get to that in a second. So yes, primarily the key to this, so there's two keys to this. One is obviously you have to get enough oxygen to the muscle cell to be able to do this. But even if you were able to provide all the oxygen, all the sugar that the cell needed to these mitochondria, the problem is it's still a slow process. If you've taken micro yet, or maybe like 400, you learned about the Krebs cycle, you learned about the citric acid cycle, where basically the sugar is broken up into two pyruvic acids. Those pyruvic acids enter the mitochondria, and basically one carbon at a time is ripped off of it as it goes around and releases the energy and does all those things. So even if you had all the resources available, it still takes time. And so if you're using ATP fast enough, you're not going to be able to keep up. Now, that doesn't mean you can't sprint, because luckily there is a second way we can make energy. And that second way of making energy is anaerobic respiration. This, unlike aerobic, doesn't occur in the mitochondria. This just occurs in the cytoplasm. And what's the big difference between aerobic and anaerobic?
You don't need oxygen.
Yeah. This one does not use oxygen. The advantage of this is it's very fast. Basically, what is happening here, what occurs is glycolysis. Any idea what glycolysis is? Well, what's glyco refer to?
Yeah, it's glucose. It's the breakdown of
Yeah.
glucose.
It's basically where all we do is we split the glucose. And when we split the glucose, we basically get two pyruvates, or you can also call them pyruvic acids. And when you do that, you get 2 ATP. So it is an incredibly fast process. But notice before you were getting 32 to 36 ATP from a single glucose. Now you're getting 2. Right? Instead of getting 34 miles to the gallon, you're now getting 2 miles to the gallon. You just went from your hybrid to your Hummer. The advantage is that this is very, very fast, but it also uses your fuel very, very quickly. So that's one of the big problems with this. Problem one is you use up your glucose very quickly. Anyone know what the second problem with this process is?
It forms lactic acid.
Exactly, right? As we mentioned before, splitting of the glucose is actually the first step in aerobic respiration. That glucose is split into 2 pyruvic acids. But with oxygen, those pyruvic acids enter into the mitochondria. Without oxygen, these pyruvic acids cannot enter the mitochondria, and instead they're converted into lactic acid. And lactic acid is toxic to the cell. And it is one of the main causes of muscle fatigue. So we can make enough energy to sprint for a minute, but we're not going to be able to sprint for hours, the same way that we can stand for hours, assuming we're not 7 months pregnant. All right, we've done it here on the board, but let's go back here and see the pretty pictures. Again, as we talked about, there is this reversible equation where it all depends on what's going on. When the body is at rest, the muscle is at rest, there's a lot of ATP, and our creatine stores that energy as creatine phosphate. You were talking about supplements. One of the supplements that bodybuilders will take is they will take, like you were talking about, those protein shakes. Those protein shakes contain creatine in it. And so if we can get more creatine into the muscle cell before we work out, it can store more of that those phosphates, making more creatine phosphate, and potentially keep that muscle contracting for a longer period of time by having more money in the bank. Of course, the problem when you take those protein shakes is the vast majority of that creatine doesn't make it into the muscle cells. So instead, it just floats around inside your blood, ending up in your kidneys, causing your kidney to have to overprocess all those proteins. And so excessive amounts of creatine or those protein shakes can be damaging to the kidneys. Of course, when you exercise, again, that is your myosin heads are using the ATP. So there's an increase in the amount of ADP in the cell. And so then the creatine phosphate, which has just been storing the energy, gives it back to the ADP, making more ATP and allowing the muscle to contract for a longer period of time. And like we said, this is a more stable energy molecule than the ATP. So it allows us to rapidly replace ATP. Notice the key here. We are not making new ATP. We're not making new energy.
Recycling it?
Yeah, or we're just really changing the form. We're taking it from the bank into our pocket. Right? We're just changing the form. We're just changing the location of it, but we're not making new. And like I said, with this, you could add another 20 seconds to your contraction, and suddenly we're able to contract a muscle for 30 seconds of time. But if we want to contract a muscle for more than 30 seconds, we can't rely on stored energy anymore. We have to make energy. And that starts with aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, remember, requires oxygen. As we talked about, we start with the splitting of the glucose into pyruvic acid. Then with oxygen, this pyruvic acid is able to enter into the mitochondria, is broken down to produce that super efficient 32 to 36 ATP. Notice it's 32 net. It actually makes 34 to 36, but 2 is used in the process. So we net somewhere between 32 and 34. Again, Krebs cycle, you can worry about that in micro. But the point is, it's incredibly efficient. A single glucose produces over 30 ATP. And so with that, we're able to sustain a moderate amount of activity forever. We can stand for hours. Right? Everything is walking distance if you have the time. All right, you could walk from now till New York if you had the time to get there. So we could maintain this activity for long, long periods of time. The problem is if we are doing a maximal force contraction, if we're trying to use a muscle at its peak level of activity, this can only sustain it for about a third of the energy, provide only about a third of the energy needed. So we need a quick and dirty way of making up that ATP. And that quick and dirty way of making up the ATP is anaerobic respiration. Again, as we talked about, splitting the glucose into pyruvic acid, that process of glycolysis, does produce 2 ATP. And we don't need oxygen for that. The problem with this is it's much more expensive. From each glucose, now instead of getting 32, we're only getting 2. And the other problem is without that oxygen to move that pyruvic acid into the mitochondria, it's going to form that lactic acid. And that lactic acid is one of the major factors that leads to muscle fatigue. All right. Questions on those 4 methods of getting the energy necessary to contract a muscle?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
How fast is the anaerobic? Like how many anaerobic respirations can you do per one aerobic respiration?
That is an excellent question. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. That's a great question. It is much, much faster, especially when you think about the fact that glycolysis is the first step of aerobic respiration. So basically, instead of doing the 16 steps that are required to be able to completely break down our sugar in aerobic respiration, you're just doing step 1 and stopping. So it is, massively faster, but I don't know percentage-wise how much faster it would be. That's a great question. I don't have a good answer for.
Okay.
Sarah, you also ask an excellent question, but before we can talk about how we get rid of that lactic acid, we need to talk about what that lactic acid does. So we are going to talk about that, but we have to build to that. We're still building to that. All right. All right. Awesome questions. Those are great. I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know. That's an awesome question. I don't have a good answer for that one. But I can answer the question about the lactic acid. That one I can at least answer. But before we get there, we have to talk about what this lactic acid does. As we mentioned, lactic acid is one of the main factors that leads to muscle fatigue. Now, we've already talked about this once, but I want to emphasize it again. Muscle fatigue is not muscle failure. Muscle fatigue is when the muscle cannot perform at the required level of activity. We already talked about one example of this, and that example of this was our baseball pitcher. All right. Again, at the start of the game, that baseball pitcher is able to throw the ball 100 miles an hour. But by the 7th inning, he's now only throwing the ball 93 miles an hour. As we talked about, being able to throw a ball 93 miles an hour is incredibly impressive. But is it performing at the level it was at the beginning of the game?
No.
No. And so that is muscle fatigue. Or let's talk about another example. I grew up in Ohio. And if we've learned nothing over the past few months, places like Ohio, places like Texas, places like Alabama, as you guys have learned, is like a completely different world. So growing up in Ohio, in middle school, elementary school, because that would have been, it was 4th grade. When you got in trouble in class, you got sent up to the principal's office. And what the principal would do is you would get down on your knees and you would put your arms out. And he would put a textbook in each of your hands. And you had to hold those textbooks up until he got tired. Now, if you could hold those textbooks up until he got tired, then you got to stop and you could go back to the classroom. If you could not hold them up till he got tired, then you got swatted with a paddle and then sent back to the classroom. And on the 3 occasions that I got sent to the principal's office, was I able to hold those books up until he got tired? What do you think? Was anybody ever able to hold those books up till he got tired? No, of course not. Eventually you would get tired, your arms would go down, you'd get your paddling, and you'd get sent back to the classroom. Now, I dropped that book because my arm fatigued. Did that mean my muscle failed? I could no longer move my arms. When I got back to the classroom, I couldn't write with my pencil anymore because my arms were just completely dead at the side of my body?
No.
No, of course not, right? So again, muscle fatigue does not mean muscle failure. It means that the muscle is not able to perform at the level required. Now, we do not fully understand the mechanism of muscle fatigue, but there are many factors that we do understand. Some of the primary causes of muscle fatigue include the depletion of metabolic resources, right? What do I mean by that? What are the metabolic resources I need to contract a muscle?
Loss of energy, ATP.
True. What do I need to make ATP?
Sugar and oxygen.
Yeah. Right. You guys have the right idea. If I don't have the sugar, if I don't have oxygen, I can't convert those ADP into ATPs. I can't make ATPs anymore. If I can't make as much ATP, then I'm not going to be able to perform as many power strokes, and I'm not going to be able to contract the muscle as strong as I was before. Notice, as we've talked about, we have calcium, we have sodium, we have potassium. All of these ions are constantly moving into and out of the cells. And as they're moving inside and outside of the cells, that can change the ionic imbalances, right? Magnesium is another one. Chloride is another one. These aren't ones that we talked about during the contraction, but they are factors that do play a role. So all of these ions can cause ionic imbalances, and that can interfere with the ability to produce a normal muscle contraction or a muscle contraction of the strength that we would expect. Remember, as we talked about, lactic acid is a toxin that damages the cell, but it's also an acid. Right? We talked about pyruvic acid. Other acids are produced during the chemical reaction. And as we know, when you change the pH of a muscle, what gets affected by pH changes?
Proteins.
Proteins. And as we talked about, our muscle cell is chock filled with proteins. Remember, one protein we said that's very sensitive to pH changes is troponin. So as the pH changes, it starts to change its shape, and it's harder for the calcium to bind to it. So notice, even if everything else in the cell is working perfectly, if calcium can't bind to the troponin, it's not going to be able to change the shape of the troponin. It's not going to be able to move the regulatory proteins. Fewer muscle cells can grab and pull.
Why does it only affect certain proteins?
pH changes will affect all proteins. However, because of the shape of proteins, some proteins are more sensitive to pH changes than others. Right? Again, it has to do with pH basically interferes with the hydrogen bonds. And so for some proteins, they have a shape that makes them more sensitive to those changes in the hydrogen bonds, where others are more stable.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. There's also damage to the muscle cell. All those myosin heads grabbing and pulling, right? They're generating force. Remember when I talked about with an eccentric contraction, when I'm grabbing with my myosin heads and pulling, and then you're pulling the rope the other way. When you're jerking the rope the other way from that, is it possible that those myosin heads can break off?
Yes.
Yeah, myosin heads can break off. Myomesin can become misaligned. Actin and Z discs can become misaligned. So as we damage and misalign the proteins, they become less effective. Remember, as we talked about, one of the things that makes the muscle so effective is like that crew team, everything is working in unison. If we start damaging and misaligning the proteins, then everybody's kind of working at their own pace, and it's going to be much less efficient. Right? So damaging and misaligning the proteins, all of these things are major factors. But there's one other really important factor. There I was in the classroom, in the principal's office, trying to hold the books up. And let's say, because again, here's the other thing, you're a dumb elementary student. If you were a smart college student now, you would instantly realize there's no way I'm going to be able to hold these up until he gets tired. So you're just going to drop them right away, get your punishment, and go back to the classroom. Is that what a fourth grader thinks about?
No.
No, that fourth grader struggles for as long as he possibly can to hold those up, just in that vain hope that maybe he won't get swatted, right? Of course, you know, he never succeeds, but he wrongly thinks that that's going to be the case. So let's say I was able to hold it up for 5 minutes, and then I had to give up, and then I was going to get swatted. Again, is it because my muscles failed?
No.
No. And what if instead of the principal, it was one of those active shooters that was in the classroom that we have nowadays? We didn't have those back in my day, but nowadays they have that. If an active shooter tells you to hold those books up, or he's going to put a bullet in your head, do you think you might be able to hold those books up for more than 5 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah, probably. So notice I failed at 5 minutes the first time, but not necessarily because the muscles couldn't hold it up. A less extreme example, instead of my case in elementary school, let's talk about my wife. My wife is one of those really, really disturbed people who like to go outside, start running, and continue to run for incredibly long periods of time, right? These endurance athletes, these marathon runners, right? Any of you out there know a marathon runner or are a marathon runner, know these endurance athletes like this? Anyone knows them? Okay, excellent. Now, when preparing for a marathon, right? If you're preparing for a 5K race, you typically run 5K to practice it. When you're practicing for a marathon, do you actually run the 26.2 miles of that marathon before the actual race?
No.
No. In fact, all of your practice runs basically stop prior to 20 miles. Because one of the things that all endurance athletes know is there's something magical about that 20-mile point. What happens when that endurance athlete reaches that 20-mile point? Anyone know?
Is it failure, muscle failure?
Kind of. They hit the wall. They reach that point where their body screams at them, if you take one more step, you're going to die. Every single fiber of their being tells them that. And yet, these twisted individuals, what do?
Keep going.
They take one more step. And do they die when they take that one more step?
No.
No. And then they take a second one more step, and a third one more step. And finally, they break through that wall. And then the rest of the race isn't as bad. What's happening there? Why is their body Why are they certain with 100% certainty that they cannot take one more step? Well, the reason for that is what we actually call systemic fatigue. It's your brain lying to you. When you exercise, you produce, as we mentioned, lactic acid. Lactic acid changes the pH of the muscle cell. It is toxic to the muscle cell. So do muscle cells like to keep lactic acid inside of them?
No.
No.
No. So they release that lactic acid into the blood, hoping to get it to the liver so that the liver can break it down and recycle it. So as you exercise, the amount of lactic acid in your blood increases. And one of the places your blood goes is to your brain. When your brain starts to see lactic acid inside of the blood, your brain thinks, hey, I'm using my muscles really hard if there's lactic acid. If I use my muscles really hard, I could hurt my muscles. I should stop using my muscles so that they don't get hurt. And so your brain screams at you, you have to stop. You can't take one more step. If you take one more step, you're going to die. And it's total false. It's totally your brain lying to you to try to protect you. And as we mentioned, we see that in the motivation. I could hold my book up for 5 minutes if I was going to get swatted. But if suddenly my motivation changed where I'm going to get shot, suddenly I can hold it up more. If I tell you, because we all want to watch it on camera, that you should go outside and sprint for as long as you can, how far are you going to make it?
Not very far.
Not very far. However, if a bear with an axe is chasing you, how long are you going to be able to sprint for then?
Farther.
Hopefully very far.
Yeah, a whole lot longer. So notice a lot of times when our muscles fatigue, when we have to stop doing an activity, it's not actually because our muscles can't do that activity anymore. It's because our mind is lying to us to trying to protect your muscles.
So basically it's all mental,
Well, it's not all mental. Obviously,
Right.
muscles do fatigue.
right?
But like I said, that you stop running most of the times when if you were to just sprint for as long as you thought you could sprint. Yeah, I'm going to sprint for as long as I possibly can. And at some point you stop because you feel you can't go on anymore. Right? It's more than likely your body tricking you, or your mind tricking you into thinking that. That's what happens with those endurance athletes. At that 20-mile mark, that's kind of when your brain is screaming at you, stop, you can't go anymore. But they still have 6.2 more miles to go. So they keep taking more steps and eventually they push past that, and they get that runner's high that they talk about, right? When you bust through that wall and you overcome that systemic fatigue. So yeah, so there is definitely this protective component to fatigue in place as well. All right, so those are some of the examples of how a muscle fatigues. Now, once a muscle is fatigued, is it fatigued forever?
No.
No, we need to be able to recover from it. And that's kind of what Sarah was asking about before. Obviously, one of the things we have to do to recover is to get rid of that lactic acid. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a second. But here's the other thing. Muscle fatigue and recovery is not all equal, right? What type of activity do you think is most fatiguing?
In general,
Running 26 miles.
Like
Okay.
recovery,
I
because
think swimming.
muscles are still active, they're still contracting, they're still.
Oops. What's the most, how do you, fatiguing? I don't know, whatever. What's the most fatiguing activity?
I would say recovery, because don't your muscles continue to vigorously, like they say your muscles keep going after you've worked out or after
True,
you.
but okay, so let's think of it this way. What type of activity do you do that takes the longest to recover from? So is it,
Weight bearing, like activity.
let's take it back to the Olympics. Usain Bolt and good old Meb, right? Well, you've got your marathon runner and your sprinter. Who takes longer to recover from their event?
The sprinter.
The sprinter?
Marathon runner.
The marathon.
Oh, the marathon, yeah.
Think about it. Sprinters, swimmers, sometimes they will have 3 or even 4 heats during the course of a day. Yes, when they're sprinting, they are doing a maximal intensity contractions, but it's for a very brief period of time. That marathon runner, each of their steps isn't as impactful, isn't as fatiguing, but they're taking a whole lot more of them. So while a sprinter may run 4, even 5 heats during the course of a day, how many marathons does a marathoner run during the course of a day?
1.
Yeah. How many does he run during the entire Olympics?
1.
Yeah, absolutely. So surprisingly, it is actually the slower sustained activity that lasts for a much longer period of time that is actually more fatiguing than that intense activity that occurs for a very short period of time. But regardless of which activity you do, you have to recover. And recovery is going to be when we reestablish normal conditions. Now, there are 2 main things we need to do this. One of them, as was mentioned, is to get rid of that lactic acid. Right, as we mentioned, it is toxic to the muscle cell, so we need to get rid of it. And there are basically 2.5 main ways we do this. One of these ways involves releasing it from our kidneys into our urine. Obviously, that gets it out of the body, but that isn't necessarily the most useful thing to do with it. Because as it turns out, lactic acid, so again, that gets rid of it, but it isn't the most useful use for it, because lactic acid can be recycled. It can actually be converted back into pyruvic acid. This happens basically 2 places: in the muscle cell and in the liver. And the advantage of converting it back into pyruvic acid is once it is pyruvic acid, it can enter the mitochondria to make ATP. And are we going to need ATP to recover?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We need ATP to be able to pump all those ions back where they belong. Right, get calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, get sodium back outside of the cell, potassium back into the cell, chloride and magnesium back out of the cell. So we need lots of ATP to be able to pump those ions back where we can belong. We need lots of ATP to repair and realign the proteins of our myofibril. So to make new proteins, to repair the damaged proteins. We're going to need ATP for that. So all of these things are going to be necessary. We're going to need a ton of ATP to be able to recover and to repair. However, to make all this ATP, and to convert the lactic acid into pyruvic acid, we need oxygen. In fact, when we exercise, we incur an oxygen debt. And we need to pay that back. You may not have thought of it in these terms, but you're absolutely positively aware of it. Because while you're sitting here calmly in your chair, what is your breathing rate? How many breaths do you take a minute? Anyone know what the average breathing rate at rest is?
I don't know, like 5 or 6.
It's a little more than that. A single breath takes about 5 seconds while you're at rest. So how many would that be a minute? 60 divided by 5 is, you have your
12.
phones next to you if you need to figure it out. 12, excellent, absolutely, it is 12. Spectacular. If you got up and ran around the room 16 times, would you still be just breathing 12 breaths per minute?
No.
No, your respiration would go up because while you're exercising, you have more need of oxygen. Now, as soon as you sat back down in your chair, does your breathing immediately go back to 12 breaths per minute?
No.
No.
No, your respiration stays high for a prolonged period of time. Why? Because we need to pay back this oxygen debt. We need oxygen to convert the lactic acid back into pyruvic acid. We need oxygen so that that pyruvic acid can enter into the mitochondria to make the ATP for all of these activities. We need oxygen to replace the used oxygen on our myoglobin. What was myoglobin again?
Stores oxygen?
Yeah. Remember, it was a protein like hemoglobin in the muscle cell that stores a lot of oxygen there in the muscle cell so that it's readily available to be used. Well, if it's been used up, we need to replace that oxygen in the myoglobin, right? So we need to pay back this oxygen debt. And it's not just the muscles. What other organs or organ systems incur an oxygen debt when you're exercising? What other organs or organ systems are really active when you're exercising?
Our lungs.
Your heart?
Okay, our heart, absolutely. Our lungs, the muscles of our lungs. What else?
Brain.
Brain.
Nervous system. We've been producing those action potentials. We've been releasing those neurotransmitters. Do our neurons need to recover from that activity?
Yes.
Absolutely. And I can think of one more really good one. Obvious one, but maybe not quite as obvious. What else gets a lot of use when you exercise? You get up, run around the room 16 times, or better yet, your significant other gets up and runs around the room 16 times while you're not in it. You walk into the room just as they sit down. Aside from the fact that they're breathing heavily, how else can you tell that they just ran around the room 16 times?
They're sweaty.
Yeah, their skin, right? That sweat glands producing all of that sweat is something else. So all of these organs, all of these organ systems, all of these glands, all of these are things that also incur an oxygen debt because they're active, and that oxygen debt needs to be paid back. So the two main things we need to do to recover is to get rid of that lactic acid and repay our oxygen debt. I've done this here with all the pretty words, but We have it here as well. Again, we got to remove and recycle the lactic acid and pay back that oxygen debt. Oh yeah, oh, I even forgot about that. We not only, again, do we need ATP for, among other things that we need ATP for, is we need to replace the phosphates on our creatine phosphate. We need to put some of that money back into the bank. Excellent. So all of those are things that we need oxygen for. We need oxygen to make ATP to do all of this work. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. So here is the good news. You now have learned everything you ever wanted to know about skeletal muscle cells and more. And we are almost done with skeletal muscle cells. The only thing that I need to tell you on Monday is how everything I've told you is a lie. But other than that, we are done with our skeletal muscle. So we just have one more thing where I've been lying to you this whole time and I have to explain that. And then from there, we get to briefly, very briefly, but briefly talk about smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Now that we know how skeletal muscle works, we can now understand how smooth, we can relate it to smooth and cardiac muscle. And that is going to be all we have left for lecture. All right. So what we have left for today is our origins, insertions, and actions. So let's switch gears into lab. Get rid of that. And as we mentioned, to start our lab, we need to finish off the arm. And to finish off the arm, all we have to do is the forearm. Now, again, as we look at this picture, it is a little frightening, but we will make good sense of this. We'll make it easy, we'll make it simple, and we will make sense of this. So let's go ahead and take our last break, take a 15-minute break. Looks like that means we will restart at 10:13, and I will start the recording at that time, and we will go through and I will make you comfortable if you're not already. Hopefully you've already started looking at it, but if you haven't started looking at the forearm, I will make you comfortable with the forearm, and then from there we'll move on to the leg. All right, any questions? All right, then I will see you in 15 minutes. All righty. Any questions before we get started? All right, excellent. Stunned silence. You know how much I love that. All right. As I mentioned, we are going to move on to the forearm. And the forearm can be a little tricky, but there are a couple things to remember that is going to help you to be successful in this. For starters, there's only 6 muscles. They're all superficial. And there are 3 on the front and 3 on the back of the forearm. Okay. The other most important thing to remember when it comes to these muscles is to pay attention to the tendons. The tendons are going to tell you so much more about the muscle than the belly of the muscle is going to. All right. Now, one last important thing to remember when it comes to the actions. Muscles that are on the front of the forearm, what are they going to do?
Flex.
They're going to flex. And so those are going to be our flexors. Muscles that are on the back of the forearm, what are they going to do? Extend, there you go. Excellent. Some muscles are going to be on the thumb side. What bone is on the thumb side of the forearm? Radius, excellent. Radius is rad, absolutely. And a muscle that is on the thumb side, because it's on the radius side, is going to be called a radialis. And let's think about this. If this is on the thumb side, and when it contracts and it pulls my hand that way, assuming I'm in anatomical position, that type of a movement, what type of movement is that the radialis is going to give us?
AD duct.
Exactly, that is, and which one? Again, think in anatomical position. AD or AB?
AD.
AB. It's taking it
B.
away from the
Oh
body.
yeah,
Excellent. Whereas muscles that are on the pinky side, what bone is over there?
Ulnar.
Excellent. So those are going to be all our ulnarises. And what action would an ulnaris do?
AD duct.
AD duct. So if you think about these things, that will help you to not just identify and name the muscle, but also to be able to know its functions as well. And to truly be successful, especially as you're first learning it, remember the other thing we need is we would need a really good starting point. That's the last thing that we need to be really successful. So let's ignore this picture and actually go to something from that Cosumnes River College site. Because while they didn't have the best pictures of the bicep brachia, they do have great pictures of the forearm. Here is the forearm. Is this the anterior side or the posterior side?
Posterior.
Posterior side. So being posterior muscles, these are most likely going to be involved in what?
Extending.
Extending, absolutely. Now, as I mentioned, we need a good starting point. That good starting point, remember we have that muscle that looks like a forearm muscle, but is really an elbow muscle. That's that bodybuilder muscle. That's that muscle that lines up with the thumb, putting our body in body neutral position. And what muscle was that again?
The brachial radialis.
Yeah, the brachial radialis, absolutely. Our brachial radialis. That is our good starting point. Notice right next to the brachial radialis, I'll use blue, is a muscle. And notice this muscle has a very short body and a very long tendon that goes to the posterior side of the hand on the thumb side. Based on this, what do you think this muscle on the posterior part of the arm with a tendon that goes to the back side of the thumb side of the hand might be called? There we go. Extensor, because it extends. It's on the posterior side. It extends the wrist, the carpes. It is on the thumb side, radialis, and it has a short belly and a long tendon. So it is the extensor carpi radialis longus. Notice that happens to be the longest name for a forearm muscle that we're responsible for. And we got it out of the way right off the bat.
Where exactly is that muscle? I'm just having a hard time seeing. Is
I'm
it
sorry?
like right? Where is the muscle? Like you drew a line, but I can't really, I guess, see where it starts and ends. Oh, okay, thank you.
That's the belly of the muscle.
Okay.
Okay, and then here we see its tendon going down, and we see the end of the tendon. It goes underneath some muscles, but that's where the tendon ends. Okay, so that's the extensor carpi radialis longus. Questions on that? Now, anytime we have a longus of something, guess what else we have? A shortest, or in this case, a brevis. And so not surprisingly, right next to it is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. Now, technically, do we care?
No.
No, but it's a good landmark that we can use, because once we come across that landmark, notice we see another muscle, superficial muscle right here. Here we see the belly of the muscle. I'll line it up so that it's easier to see. But again, is it the belly that we care about so much?
No.
What should we pay more attention to?
The tendon.
The tendons. And notice if I follow its tendon singular, it actually branches to form not one, not two, but three tendons that go to the backside of the fingers. What do you think this muscle that branches to go to the backside of these three fingers might be?
Extensor digitorum.
Extensor what?
Digitorum.
There you go. This is the extensor digitorum. Exactly. It extends the digits. There we go. Now, notice it doesn't go to the thumb, because as we know, the thumb opposes. The thumb is a very special joint that has a lot of muscles associated with it. And do you need to know the name of any of the muscles associated with the thumb?
No.
No. Notice it also doesn't go to the pinky, which is an important muscle if you're Dr. Evil, right? $1 million. And of course, if you're Dr. Evil, you have a mini-me. And so not surprisingly, right next to the extensor digitorum is the extensor digitorum minimus, the mini-me, which happens to have a tendon that goes to the pinky. And again, I ask you, while that is a muscle that we can clearly see and recognize, do we care?
No.
No. So we hop over that to our third muscle that we need to know. What color have I used? Let's say use brown. Notice again, the belly of it is here. But it's not the belly we care about, it is the tendon. And notice the tendon comes right here. In fact, let's make this, let's actually do it this way, a white dot. If you notice right here, like you can feel on your wrist, there is a bump that you can feel that sticks out right there. That bump that sticks out right there is the styloid process of the ulna. And notice this tendon comes behind it. So because it comes behind it, it is going to bring the hand back. And so what might this muscle be that is going to bring the hand back on the posterior side of the pinky?
Extensor carpi ulnaris.
Oops, hold on. And the extensor carpi ulnaris. And there you go. Just that easily, we have identified the three posterior muscles of the forearm we are responsible for. We used our landmark, the brachial radialis, define the muscle with the long tendon that goes to the thumb side of the back of the hand, the extensor carpi radialis longus. We found the muscle in the middle of the forearm, whose muscle belly by itself isn't very distinct, but it very clearly has three branches to form three tendons that go to the back of the hand, the extensor digitorum. And we have a belly on the pinky side, whose tendon, more importantly, goes to the back side of the styloid process. So it is going to extend the hand, and it is the extensor carpi ulnaris.
So on the exam, when you're pointing to one of these muscles, are you going to point at like the belly?
Yes,
Oh, okay.
because the belly is the more easy part to see, but you're going to need to look to see where its tendon goes to know what it is. All right. Now, let's finish it off while we're here. While we're here, let's talk their actions. How many actions does the extensor carpi radialis longus have?
2.
And notice its name tells you everything about it. What are the two actions?
Extend and adduct, adduct, and
There we go. And again, remember, we always assume anatomical position. So even though I have my hand pointed this way, this is still an extension. This is still an adduction. So, right, if I'm a waiter and I extend the hand and I adduct it so that I can, carry my plates in a fancy fashion, even though I'm not in anatomical position, that is still an extension. That is still an adduction.
is on the, I think I messed up because on the sheet it says abduct.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, no. I said abduct, but I think I wrote it. I didn't. You are correct. Thumb side abduct. Yep. Remember, the thumb is the lateral most structure. So if you're moving it to the thumb side, then that's an abduction. And if the extensor carpi radialis longus extends and abducts, what does the extensor carpi ulnaris do?
Extend and adduct.
Exactly. And we forgot to say what it does too. Or remember, we could also say wrist as well, which is useful because the carpi reminds us that it's the wrist. So again, remember, we can talk about the joint or the part of the body that it moves. Either would be acceptable. And that just leaves us with the extensor digitorum. What does the extensor digitorum do?
Extend the phalanges.
That it? It's not a trick question. Is that all it does?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. And technically, digits 2, 3, and 4. But if you just say extends the digits, I would be fine with that. All right. So just that easily, we're halfway through the forearm. Not too bad, not too scary. Now, in fact, while we're here, so any questions on this before I erase this? While we're here, I want to show you something else. Notice while we're here, we actually see the next, whoops, that's horrible. Maybe I'll do it this way so it's easier to see. Notice while we're here, we actually see the belly of the next muscle we're going to be responsible for. Notice here we are on the back side of the hand, but on the back side of the forearm, there's actually a belly that starts here, starts on the posterior side. However, do we determine its function by where the belly is?
No, the tendon, right?
No, we determine its function by where its tendon goes. So notice if we flip the forearm around, again, we see a little bit, let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's make it lighter. We see a little bit of the muscle. Notice this muscle, we saw more of it on the back than we do on the front. And it's pretty much on the edge of the arm. But we don't care about where the belly is. What we care about is where its tendon goes. And notice in this case, the tendon comes in front of the styloid process on our ulna. So it comes here to the front. And since its tendon comes to the front on the pinky side, what does that make that muscle?
Is it the flexor carpi ulnaris?
Exactly. So in fact, I'm going to cheat and go back. Bing, bonk. Actually, let's let them show it to us. Notice the extensor carpi ulnaris and the flexor carpi ulnaris are right next to each other on the posterior side of the arm. What makes one, they're both on the pinky side, so they're both carpi ulnarises. But what makes the flexor and the extensor is where their tendons go. The extensor comes behind the styloid process, so it extends. The flexor comes in front of the styloid process, so it flexes. Notice it's not where the belly is, it is where its tendon goes. And here on the anterior side, we very clearly see that tendon. In fact, notice this tendon is one of, and I'll use a different color for these, 3 prominent tendons that can be seen on the anterior side of the arm. In fact, if I take my watch off, when you flex your forearm, you can actually see those 3 tendons stick out prominently, right? So you can, I can do it more on one side. It's not as prominent on the other side for me, but on here, I can see those 1, 2, 3 tendons sticking out very prominently on the forearm. And these are the 3 main tendons that we care about on the anterior side of the forearm. So let me go ahead and erase this. Hear that. So as we mentioned, we see the little bit of the belly here, but its tendon comes to the front side of the pinky. So how did we identify this muscle again?
The flexor carpi ulnaris.
Excellent. Notice our next muscle has a small belly with a very long tendon that goes all the way up to the palm of the hand. What might we call such a muscle?
Palmaris longus.
Excellent. And right next to it, we have a muscle with a nice prominent belly. Oops, hold on. Notice this belly is more on the pinky side of the arm, but we care about where its tendon goes. And notice its tendon comes across to the thumb side. So what might we call such a muscle?
Flexor carpi radialis.
And notice from there, we come straight to a muscle that lines right up with the thumb, with the thumb. What muscle is this that lines up right with the thumb?
Extensor carpi radialis longus.
Where did we start?
What do you
We had a
mean? What is it?
landmark muscle that we started with. What was that landmark muscle we started with?
Brachial Radialis.
And lo and behold, we're back at the Brachial Radialis. Much like Magellan, we have now gone around the entire circumference of our forearm, and we're back where we started. All righty. One last piece of business. Functions. What are the functions of the flexor carpi ulnaris?
To flex and adduct the hand or the wrist.
Excellent. What is the function of the palmaris longus?
To flex the hand.
Notice again, because it's right in the middle, it can't twist it to the left or to the right, so it's just going to flex the hand. And what is the function of the flexor carpi radialis?
Flex and abduct.
The hand or the wrist. And there you go. Just that easily, we have done the 3 muscles on the anterior part. Now, hopefully you've tried to flex your wrist to see some of these. For some of you, let's do, I don't want to do this. Actually, no, I'm just going to erase them. For some of you, all 3 tendons may not stand out as obviously. However, most of you, especially on the dominant hand, should see at least one big prominent tendon that sticks out. On your dominant hand, if you notice, the palmaris longus sits on top of this white sheath. Notice there's a little bit of a white sheath here that stabilizes the tendons and holds them in place. Any idea what that structure might be?
The flexor retinaculum.
The flexor retinaculum. And again, I don't care how you pronounce it as long as you spell it correctly. Exactly, the flexor retinaculum. And that flexor retinaculum helps to stabilize the tendons in place. But notice the tendon of the palmaris longus is above it. So typically that palmaris longus tendon always sticks out. However, notice I just said on your dominant hand. On some percentage of the population, and it could be as high as 20%, at least one, if not both, of those palmaris longus muscles actually fuse with other muscles. And so if you look down and don't see that palmaris longus tendon, don't freak out and go running to the doctor. You just may be one of those people where it fused together with some of the other muscles and doesn't stand out prominently. And notice if we have a flexor retinaculum, what might the other structure we're responsible for be?
Extensor rectal, I don't know.
Retinaculum. And notice we see that on the posterior side. So again, there's the extensor retinaculum. And they don't show it on this one, but here is the flexor retinaculum. So like I said, as scary as the forearm may look, as long as you follow those rules, find your starting point, follow the tendons, it will tell you everything about them. And now that we've done it on this nice model, let's go back to the scary looking picture from your textbook and do the exact same thing. Notice we start up here with the brachial radialis, our starting point, that muscle that is on the lateral aspect of the hand, lining up with the thumb. And right next to that is a small bellied muscle with a, well, here, let's make it stand out more. Small bellied muscle with a long tendon that goes to the backside of the thumb. So what is this small bellied muscle right here?
The extensor carpi radialis longus.
There you go. Extensor carpi radialis longus. Smallest belly, longest name. Notice next to it is the extensor carpi radialis brevis that we don't care about. But after that, we have a muscle. And notice if I cheat, I can get lost in the muscles up here. But if I come down here to find the tendons that are coming out, as I find the tendons that are coming out, I can see the belly of the muscle with those tendons that branch to go to the fingers. Notice they go under the extensor retiniculum. And what is this muscle with the branching tendons that goes to the fingers?
Extensor digitorum.
Exactly. Notice next to it is the muscle that goes to the pinky, the mini-me, but we don't care about the mini-me. Instead, what we care about is the muscle right next to it. And the muscle right next to it again, with its tendon going to the backside of the pinky, is the extensor carpi ulnaris. Now, notice from this posterior view, I can also see most of that medial belly that is the flexor carpi ulnaris. But remember, it's not about where the belly is, it's where its tendon goes. And notice here, we can see the tendon is going to the front side of the pinky. So even though its belly is located here on the backside or on the medial aspect of the hand, we're actually going to see its tendon on the anterior side. So it is our flexor. So those are our three, and I guess a half muscles we can see from the posterior view. Questions on those? So notice when we switch to our anterior view, again, notice we don't see much of its belly. Its belly is much more on the back of the hand. But what we clearly see is its tendon coming in front of the styloid process of the ulna. There's the ulna and its styloid process. This comes to the front of it. So it is our flexor carpi ulnaris. Then two more prominent muscles. Tiny bellied muscle with a massive tendon that goes above the flexor retiniculum, straight to the palm of the hand, points right at the palm of the hand. I know my drawing's not that great, but again, straight to the palm of the hand. What muscle is that?
Palmaris longus.
Palmaris longus. Notice right next to the palmaris longus is a muscle that starts more on the medial aspect of the hand, but notice we don't care where the belly is, we care where the tendon goes. And this tendon goes in front of the thumb side of the hand. So of course that muscle is our
Flexor carpi radialis.
flexor carpi radialis. And then from there, we're back home where we started. Oops. Back to the brachial radialis. And we've gone around the circumference of the forearm. So, like I said, it can be intimidating as we look at these pictures, especially over here at the deep one. There's a whole ton of little muscles that affect the forearm, that affect the hand. You're only responsible for 6 of them, 3 on the front, 3 at the back. And their tendons tell you everything about them. So look for the tendons, follow the tendons, and it will tell you everything about that muscle.
So the
So the flexor retinaculum is always on the anterior side. So that'll
Yep,
be
because it stabilizes the flexors, whereas the connective tissue on the back stabilizes the extensors.
Okay.
Yep. And notice your textbook shows it even better than the model. Here we clearly see on the anterior side that connective tissue that stabilizes most, not all, because notice the Palmaris Longus is on top of it, but most of the tendons for our flexors of the hand. And if we go back a picture, we see that very prominent extensor retinaculum that stabilizes all of the tendons on the backside, all the extensors of the hand. So yep, those retinaculums, or reticuli, I guess would be the plural, stabilize most, not all the tendons because of that pesky Palmaris Longus. Why it has to be different, don't ask me, but it is. But yeah, stabilizes most of the tendons associated with the hand, front and back. All right. Any other questions on the forearm or the muscles of the arm in general? All right. From there, we move to the leg, starting with the prominent superficial posterior muscle of the body. In fact, it primarily forms your posterior, and that is the gluteus maximus. We take a slightly closer view of it. We can see it here. Again, as I mentioned, it is a posterior muscle. But notice something else about it as well. While it is a posterior muscle, notice it's also a parallel muscle. All of the fascicles basically start at the midline and project laterally to where they insert. Now, let's go to our drawing and draw the origin and the insertion for this. So we're on here. Let's make it bigger. What is the origin of the gluteus maximus?
The dorsal ilium sacrum and coccyx.
Okay, excellent. So the dorsal part, not the crest so much, but the dorsal part of the ilium, the sacrum, and the coccyx. So a very medial origin. And what is its insertion?
The gluteal tuberosity and the iliotibial band. Yeah.
All right. Notice when we learned about the femur, we saw this prominent rough V shape that sits at the top of the linea aspera, and that is the bony attachment of it. However, if we go back to the picture, we can actually see in the picture where that insertion is. Notice here's that nice V shape where some of the fascicles are attaching. But notice, because they're coming across, many of them attach to this tendon, this tendinous structure, this thickened connective tissue structure on the side of the leg. A good place to see this is to look on the side of the leg, and if we hold on. In your modules, there is one more PDF under the lab handouts. Called leg models. And when you look at the leg models, you see something like this. Notice here again, we can see where that some of the fascicles of the gluteus maximus, this here is the gluteus maximus, are coming into that gluteal tuberosity on the back of the leg. But notice most of the fascicles are coming into this big, long, white structure that goes all the way up from the iliac crest all the way down to the lateral condyle of the tibia, which is why it's called the iliotibial tract. Or iliotibial band, or what do some people, especially athletes, especially runners, tend to call this? There you go. Mitch jumped the gun on me. Absolutely. I love that. IT band. I love when you anticipate my questions. Absolutely love that. Absolutely. This is, if you've ever talked to a runner or an athlete who has problems with their IT band, this is what they're talking about. There is a thick, fibrous connective tissue fascia that covers the entire thigh region. So this big thigh region is covered by a big, huge connective tissue sheath called the fascia lata. The fascia lata is basically a pressure cuff. What do I mean by a pressure cuff? When might you use a pressure cuff? Okay, true. You use it for taking the sigma-manometer to take your blood pressures. But that's not, I was thinking more in terms of if you are in a prolonged stay in a bed at a hospital. One of the things that they will put around your lower legs are these pressure cuffs that every once in a while will inflate and squeeze your legs and then stop and relax. And why do they do that?
To increase the circulation?
Yeah, it helps to push the blood back towards the heart. Walking, moving our legs contracts the muscles. And in fact, muscle contraction helps to send the blood back to your heart. But if you're laid up in bed, you really can't contract those muscles as easily. So they squeeze the muscles for you. Well, that's kind of what the fascia lata does. It's stable, like all fascias, it stabilizes the muscles of the legs, but it also helps to move the blood against gravity back up towards your heart. Of course, do you want it just to be like a roll of duct tape that is just wrapped around your leg and never changes shape or never changes its tension?
No.
No. So we need a way to be able to modify that. And notice, even though we're jumping ahead a little bit, there happens to be a muscle that attaches to the iliotibial band. And the iliotibial band is a thickened part of the fascia lata. So when we put tension into the iliotibial band, it puts tension in the fascia lata, stabilizes and squeezes the leg muscles. Now, for those runners and athletes who are aware of it, this is a fibrous connective tissue sheath. And connective tissues don't stretch and expand as easily as like muscle tissues do. So as your muscles enlarge or your muscles inflame from running, they can push on this band and it can pull on the knee, displacing the kneecap a little bit, causing pain or discomfort in the hip or pain and discomfort in the knee. And so one of the things that they'll try to do is help to, they'll use things like rollers or other stretches to help to stretch that out to help to eliminate those issues. And even though it's jumping ahead a little bit, what do you think we call this tiny little muscle on the anterior lateral aspect of the leg that is going to put the tension in the fascia lata? Well, if I only had a list of the muscles in front of me, I might be able to figure out what muscle puts tension in the fascia lata. Seriously? There we go. Mitch has got it. It's the tensor fasciolata. The tensor fasciolata's name tells you what it does. It puts tension in the fascia lata. It pulls on the IT band. to form that tension on that pressure cuff that is the fascia lata.
Do you have a picture of what the fascia lata actually looks like?
Not here. However, I'll be honest, I haven't looked at it, but one of the things that I was curious about is on your cadaver pictures. So let's take a moment and look for that.
Are you responsible for cadaver pictures on the exam?
Well, notice how I put like that fuzzy board around it and did that. I could say, you know, identify the structure this represents or something like that. So that might be one way that I could show it. But let's see what's on my lab and mastering. Practice anatomy lab, cadaver, muscular system, lower limb. Yeah, here we go. Notice this connective tissue sheath that wraps around the whole thing. I wonder if we have a better picture. Well, here we see the side where it's been removed, and here we see the side where it's still intact. Let's open for an up close view. Those are two pretty good ones. Notice here, we see the entire fascia lata intact. Here we can see how, where's my highlighter? Where it's wrapping around the leg. But notice in the next picture, it's been removed, but what we can still see is the iliotibial band. Notice the iliotibial band can still be seen. So we can see that really nicely on here, and I assume, nope, just showing the muscles. But so we can see that pretty nicely there. I was hoping for more up close view, and there might be some in here if we get closer. We go through the pictures. Here, let's go to the gallery. There we go. So notice here, we see that fascia lata wrapped around all of the muscles. And when we peel it away, then we can see the muscles underneath. But what we still see is that thickened iliotibial band that is still on the side. And then notice also we can really nicely see the tensor fascia lata that is putting the tension on that band. So that's not bad ways to show it. That's not horrible. All right. And so, yes, when we look at our, I gotta go back here. Leg model. Obviously, the iliotibial band is very obvious, but it doesn't have a fascia lata on it. No, so this doesn't show the fascia lata, but I could draw one just like I did with that cube. So that could be a way that I could show it. All righty. So as we were just finished talking about, we have the origin on the dorsal part of the ilium, sacrum and coccyx. We have our insertion into the gluteal tuberosity, but also into that iliotibial band that's along the side there. And as I mentioned, all of the fascicles basically run parallel between these two structures, which helps us to understand its function. While this is a posterior muscle, how many joints does it cross?
One.
One, the hip. And so what is the obvious action that it is going to have on the hip?
It's going to rotate the hip.
Well, being a posterior muscle, what's the obvious action?
Extending.
Yeah, it's going to extend the hip, but you're right. It's also going to pull on the hip. So what is the second action of the gluteus maximus?
Lateral rotation.
Lateral, but again, remember, we always think of the rotations in terms, assuming this is my leg, my right leg, what it does to the anterior part. So when it turns the foot outward, the anterior part is moving outward. So that would be a lateral rotation, right? So it laterally rotates and extends the leg, right? Which for those of you who took ballet, isn't this like first position or something like that? If you think about it, when you're
Yes.
standing upright with your feet turned out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically getting into first position is what your gluteus maximus does for you. This prominent superficial posterior muscle. I make a point of emphasizing that because deep to it, right? Anytime there's a gluteus maximus, what else is there going to be?
Gluteus medius.
A gluteus minimus, right? There's going to be a maximus, there's going to be a minimus, and you're not responsible for that. But in this case, there is also one in between, a gluteus medius. Notice it is deeper than the gluteus maximus. It is superior to the gluteus maximus, but there's one other huge difference between the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius. While the gluteus maximus is posterior, the gluteus medius is actually a lateral muscle. We really see that when we draw its origins and its insertions. So when we draw it, notice we look here at this lateral view of the leg. And what is the origin of the gluteus medius?
Lateral ilium.
Yeah, notice it doesn't go up onto the crest. Underneath the crest, basically in this region here, this indented fossa on the ilium, on the lateral aspect of the ilium, is our origin. That's probably enough. And conveniently enough, it inserts into the lateralmost point of the hip, which you all know because it was on the 30-point review and it was on the exam. What is the lateralmost bone feature of the hip? There you go. The greater trochanter of the femur. So this is a big, prominent lateral muscle. Now, how many joints does it cross?
One.
One, just the hip. Being a lateral muscle, guess what its most obvious action is?
Abduct.
Yeah, well, again, I think being lateral, the most obvious is that it is going to abduct. Absolutely, bring it out to the side. But Mitch, you're also right, it does have a second action. The drawing doesn't do as great of a job of lining it up right, but these don't quite line up perfectly. So as it lifts it up, it is going to medially rotate it. So basically turn it so that your foot points down, your toes point down as your leg is going out towards the side. So it is going to abduct and medially rotate the hip. All right. Questions on this? There's one other point I want to make about this muscle, both of these muscles. If we come back over to this picture. Right. When you make an intermuscular injection, when they do an injection into the muscle, there's basically three things that they worry about. It must be large enough where it can take the entire bolus of the medicine. It must have the right perfusion rate, the right blood flow to the area. So let's say that way, right? Blood flow. So that it is able to distribute the medicine at the appropriate rate throughout the body. But it also needs to avoid large nerves because you don't want to accidentally inject into a nerve that could damage that nerve. Of course, in the movies all the time, because it's funnier, when it's time to give someone that intramuscular injection, it's always right into the buttocks. However, in real life, is that where they give adults intramuscular injections?
No.
No, they actually give it into the gluteus medius. Typically, as a nurse, what you do is you find the iliac crest. That's easy to palpate and feel. And then you go about an inch or two down from that, and that is where you make the injections. The reason you don't do it into the gluteus maximus is, yes, the gluteus maximus has a good muscle mass to it. Yes, it has a good perfusion rate, but this is also the region where your largest nerve, your sciatic nerve that travels all the way down to the bottom of your leg, remember, leaving out that greater sciatic notch of our os coxa, travels out. And do you want to risk hitting that sciatic nerve and
No.
irritating it? No.
No.
So you do it either in the gluteus medius in the hip, or what's the other muscle that is commonly used for intramuscular injections?
Deltoid.
Yeah, which notice is our other big lateral muscle. Large muscle mass, good blood flow, no large nerves in that region. So these two lateral muscles, the deltoid and the gluteus medius, are the primary muscles used for intramuscular injections. All right. Questions on that? All right, that brings us to our first muscle group of the leg, known as the hamstrings. Any idea why this muscle group is called the hamstrings?
Looks like a ham. I don't know.
Yeah.
Actually, you're very, very close to being right. Absolutely. The anatomy of our musculature of our leg is very similar to the anatomy of the musculature of a pig's leg. Notice in particular here at the back of the knee, there are these four muscle bellies that come together into this triangular region. We have the two bellies of the gastrocnemius, or calf muscles. And then we have these muscles up here. We have the bicep femoris coming down here with its two bellies. And we have the semimembranosus and semitendinosus that come over this way. They form this diamond-shaped region, which is known as the popliteal fossa. And pigs have a popliteal fossa as well. When they are butchering the pig and cutting it up into pieces, the leg is basically what is cured, hung up and dried and salted often to make the ham. So to hang it while it cures, they have these big, large hooks, and they put this hook into the popliteal fossa, into the meat of the back of the leg, so that they can string the ham up so that it can cure and become ham. So this is the muscle where they string up the hams to cure them, and so that is why they're called the hamstring muscles. As I said before, meat is muscle. So this is a perfect example of that. Now, notice there are three muscles that make up the hamstrings: the semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, and the third is the bicep femoris. But with a name like bicep femoris, what does that tell you?
There's two bellies.
Two bellies. And if it has two bellies, what else does it have?
Two origins.
Two origins. Absolutely. So notice, essentially, we have two bellies of one muscle that comes to one side, and then two muscles that come to the other side in our hamstring. So let's go here. There we go. All right, here is our posterior view. And let's draw the origins and the insertions of our Bicep femoris first. Now, one more quick thing we need to remind ourselves of as we're doing this. What is the definition of a muscle group?
2 or more muscles.
Right, can't have a group of 1.
Yeah.
What else?
They work together to perform a similar action.
Yeah, similar actions. They don't have to be identical actions, but they have to be similar actions. So they must have similar actions so that they're going to work together. And what is the third criteria?
Don't they have to share an insertion or?
Or insertion. They only have 1 insertion, right?
Well, they need to share. It doesn't have to be the origin or it doesn't have to be the insertion, but it has to be at least one of them. So you're right. It has to share an attachment point, either the origin or the insertion. In some cases, it'll be both, but they have to share at least one. So that's something to look for while we're looking at these muscles of the hamstring. Now, let's start with that in mind with our bicep femoris. How many bellies does the bicep femoris have?
2.
And what are they?
The long and short head. Long head, short head.
Kind of sounds very similar to what we saw in the bicep brachia. Right? Bicep brachia has a long head and a short head. But really, that's the only thing that they share in common. Remember, our bicep brachia, the 2 bellies were side by side. But let's see where the bellies are here. What is the origin for the long head?
The shield tuberosity.
Excellent. The origin of the long head is the ischial tuberosity, your butt bone, right? That's what we sit on, holds our weight. Excellent. Ischial tuberosity. Spectacular. What is the origin of the short head?
When you asked, bro.
Excellent. That raised ridge on the backside of the femur. And what is the insertion for both?
Well, it says common tendon into head of fibula, and lateral condyle of tibia.
Yeah, notice right over here. Now, when I say lateral condyle, do you think it's going to be here on the condyle surface? Do you think that'd be a good place to put a tendon where the head of the femur is going to sit and rub up against it? No, of course not. So it's going to be on the side of the lateral condyle and the head of the fibula. And again, remember, common tendon just means that they come together. So notice if we draw these 2 muscles, here is our short head. It goes basically from here to here. And here is our long head. It basically goes from here to here. Notice the long head sits almost entirely on top of the short head. So unlike the arm where the 2 sit side by side, in the leg, one is superficial and one is deep. Notice we see that when we look at our illustration. Notice here, if we look closely, we can see here is, well, that doesn't show up at all. Here is the long head of the bicep femoris, and that teeny little bit sticking out right here is the short head that we can see underneath it. Notice we don't see it very well on this picture. Luckily, if we go back to here, notice here, looking at the lateral aspect of the leg, we can see the long head of the bicep femoris. And then peeking out underneath it, we can see the short head of the bicep femoris. So notice we can see it from this side view. However, to get the best view of the short head, we actually have to remove the long head. Notice if we remove the long head, then here we clearly see the entire short head of the bicep femoris. And would I show the model to you this way on the exam?
Probably not.
Probably.
Absolutely. Now, would I take the long head of the bicep femoris out and have that sitting on the table by itself and ask you to figure
No.
out what it is?
No.
No.
No, of course not. But for some of these deeper muscles, is it easier to see them if you remove some of the superficial ones?
Yeah.
Notice the gluteus maximus has been removed back here, so we don't see that. And in fact, the semimembranosus and semitendinosus have been removed. So I have no problem showing you a model where some of the muscles have been removed if it does a great job of showing the muscle. And so here, notice we could see it peeking out from the side, and it certainly is easy to see from here. We can clearly see it here on the side. Yeah. Right, again, here's that little bit of it sticking out here. That is, in my opinion, a fair way to show it with it all intact. But it also is much easier to see like this. So I would have no problem removing some of the muscles so that you could see the entire short belly here underneath.
But for the exam, you said you would or you wouldn't show us the one with some of them removed.
I will.
Okay.
If it's a deeper muscle, I will remove. I have no problem showing you models with muscles removed to see deeper muscles easier. I will not, however, remove a muscle and have it sitting on the table by itself. Even if it was an obvious muscle like the deltoid, I'm not going to rip the deltoid off and have it sitting on the table by itself and have you try to figure out what it is. I won't do that, but I will remove some of the muscles so you can see deeper things more clearly. Okay. Excellent. Notice one more thing I think I have here.
Mitch asked a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, hopefully at this point, you know your left versus your right. So I will not hold you for left and rights on this exam. Okay. Great question though, but no, I won't do that. All right, let's jump back here and redraw those origins and those insertions. So again, the insertion is into the head of the fibula and the lateral condyle of the tibia. We have the origin of the short head on the linea aspera and the origin of the long head here on the ischial tuberosity. Now, how many joints does this cross?
One.
One?
Two.
Well, two.
Two. What are the two?
Your knee.
The hip. And
The
Yeah.
hip and knee.
The knee and the hip. So it is going to affect both the knee and the hip. And remember, the knee is the wonky one. So being a posterior muscle, what is the obvious function on the hip?
extensions. Or extending.
Extends, it brings it back. And because the knee is wonky, what is the obvious function on the knee?
The flex.
Yeah, remember, because the knee is backwards. The knee is going to flex. So it flexes the knee and extends the hip. Excellent. But notice also that this, as it's pulling the insertion towards the origin, it is also going to twist the leg. And as it twists the leg, the anterior side, which way does it go? Does it go towards the midline or away from the midline?
Towards the midline.
Again, we're looking at it from the back. So I'm
Oh,
looking at
away
it from the
from-
back. So as it turns it that way, it's the front is moving away from the midline. So what type of action is that?
Lateral.
Yep. So it extends the hip, laterally rotates the hip, and flexes the knee. All right. Questions on this? You guys have been working on your muscle activities. Has anybody come up with, I don't know, I don't remember if this one's on the list or not. Is it, I don't, if let's, whether it's on the list or not, is it, can anybody think of an activity where you might use this muscle? I have a good one. That's why I asked.
Maybe like stronger defense. I don't know.
No, actually, I like Augustina sitting. Sitting is a great example. In fact, Big, when she was 2 or 3 years old, my oldest daughter, when you would ask her to, you know, she'd be running around the house and like, you know, crazy person like kids do. And so you'd tell her to sit down, crisscross applesauce. And I won't demonstrate this for you because I would kill you. I would kill myself. But I'll explain it to you. She'd be standing up, and basically what she would do is she would use this muscle, which would extend the leg, flex the knee, and then as she laterally rotated it, basically she would swing her foot around and kick herself in the other knee. And when she kicked herself in the other knee, she would then collapse down into that crisscross applesauce position. So if you think about it, to do that, you have to extend the hip, you have to flex the knee, and then you have to laterally rotate it. And as you laterally rotate it, you swing your leg into the other leg, your foot into the other knee, and she would collapse down crisscross applesauce. All right. Questions on the bicep femoris? All right. It's done silences. So we will move to the next two muscles. And the next two muscles are what? Semimembranosus and semitendinosus. Excellent. So we have two muscles. Semi, what does semi mean?
Half.
Yeah. The semitendinosus is a muscle that is basically half tendon and half muscle. So it's got a shorter belly and a longer tendon. So it's basically a narrow, short muscle. Whereas the semimembranosus is half membrane. It is a broader, flat muscle. Kind of like, looks half like a membrane. And there's one other big difference between them. Much like the two bellies of the bicep femoris, one is superficial and one is deep. The same thing is true here. The semitendinosus is superficial. And I remember that because the T tendinosus is T on top. And the semimembranosus is deep. Now, when you have a narrow muscle sitting on top of a fatter muscle, notice the fatter muscle is going to stick out to the sides. And that's how I remember this. The semimembranosus, M for membranosus, is M for more medial. Technically, it's more lateral as well, but that isn't a good mnemonic to help me to remember. So the one that sticks out more medially is going to be the semimembranosus. Now, let's draw the origin of the semitendinosus. What is the origin of the semitendinosus?
The ischial tuberosity.
right? Notice it's sharing an origin with the bicep femoris that is required for a muscle group. And what is its insertion?
The medial condyle. Oh, wait, for which one?
For the
The-
semitendinosus.
Oh, the medial surface of the tibia.
Yeah. Notice
proximal.
again, we're going to be on the medial condyle, not up here where it meets the femur, but here underneath. So there you go. Our semitendinosus is this narrow, half muscle, half tendon muscle that sits here on the leg. And what is the origin of the semimembranosus?
The ischial tuberosity.
There you go. What is the insertion of the semimembranosus?
Medial condyle of the tibia.
Medial. Notice these two muscles have the exact same origins and insertions. The only difference is one is narrow and on top, one is wider and deep. But these two muscles have the exact same origin, the exact same insertion. So not surprisingly, what else do they share?
Their action.
The exact same actions. And again, being posterior muscles, what is the most, well, how many joints?
2.
What two joints?
The hip and the knee.
Being a posterior muscle, what is the most obvious effect on the hip?
It extends.
Being a posterior muscle, what is the most obvious effect on the knee?
Flexes.
Plexus.
Excellent. And notice this one comes again at an angle, only this way it attaches to the medial side. So as it pulls on the back, it brings the front of the leg, the front of the femur, towards the midline. So what is its third action?
Medial rotation.
There you go. Notice if we look at the picture from your textbook, here we see again this narrow muscle, superficial muscle on top. This narrow superficial muscle on top is the semitendinosus. The wider, deeper muscle that we see here, and again, because it's wider, it comes out here. We see it this way as well. That wider muscle that is underneath the semitendinosus is the semimembranosus. Notice it's medial. It's also lateral, but medial helps us to remember that, and it's the deeper muscle. So these two muscles again sit one on top of each other. Because the top muscle, the tendinosus, is smaller, it's much easier to see the membranosus. Remember, we don't really see the short head of the bicep femoris in this case, but we can
How
see.
do you medially rotate your thigh? I just don't really understand
So
what that would even look like.
think of it this way. Family reunion. Family's been gotten together forever. So it takes 45 minutes to get everybody in line for the picture. You're standing next to your sister, and the cameraman, after half an hour, 45 minutes, finally gets everybody in place, screams out 1, screams out 2, and as he screams out 3, you extend your hip, flex your knee, and as you immediately rotate your femur, what happens to your foot?
It pops out.
You whack your sister in the back. She falls forward, messing up the picture. Grandma's in tears. All the aunts and uncles are screaming and yelling. Everybody hates your sister, and you're laughing your butt off. Right? Again, as I mentioned, as an older sibling, I'm required by law to torture my younger siblings. And so that ability to whack your sibling when you're standing next to him with your foot would be a perfect example of how you could use these muscles. Or if you're less cruel than I am, you could always use it when you're playing hacky sack. That's still a thing. You
Yeah.
young whippersnappers still do hacky sack?
I think it's called something else now, but yeah.
All right. Excellent. Questions on that? All right, perfect. With that then, and let's see, do I have a good picture of the... No, not the best. All right, but here's what we can do. This is not the best model. We can sort of see from the side. This isn't the best view, but here we can see the deep semi-membranosus. And if you look closely, you can see on top of it is the semi-tendinosus. But what I do want to show you is that notice these two muscles plus two more muscles all insert into that medial condyle of the tibia. Not one, not two, not three, but four muscles all insert into that medial condyle of the tibia. And so the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus are the first two. There are going to be two more that we're going to get to, but looking at the time, we're not going to get to them today.
If we put the medial condyle.
Just putting medial condyle would be fine, absolutely.
Okay.
But conversely, if I show you a tibia, and I have, again, it won't be a drawing of a tibia, it'll be a real tibia. But if I have an arrow pointing at this medial condyle and ask you to identify all the muscles that insert there, remember that there are four. But yes, I've changed the wording of them slightly just to emphasize that they're not the exact same location, but for our purposes, just saying medial condyle for the insertion for all four of them is perfectly acceptable.
Thank you.
Okay. All righty. Excellent. Questions on that? All right. One more muscle group we have to get through today. And again, this one, while scary, is actually pretty easy. And it is the quadricep femoris. How many muscles make up the quadricep femoris?
Four.
Four. Excellent. All right. Hence the name. Come on. There, that'll work. So, what are the four muscles?
Vastus intermedius, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis.
Excellent. Our rectus femoris and the three vastus brothers. Vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. These are a muscle group. Obviously, there's clearly more than one muscle here. They are going to have similar functions, and they must share an attachment point. What was the attachment point that was shared by all of the hamstring muscles?
The medial condyle tibia.
No,
Oh, the
ischial tuberosity,
just the
absolutely.
attachment point.
And it was the origin, right? In this case, these four all share the same insertion, right? And what is that insertion that all four of these all share?
Quadriceps tendon to patella, then patellar ligament tibial tuberosity.
Excellent. But remember, the insertion is actually the bone that they ultimately attach to. So you absolutely have the right idea. The insertion is actually the tibial tuberosity.
That's it.
Nope. That is it for the insertion, yes. However, as you just rightly pointed out to me, this insertion of the quadricep femoris muscles uses some of the features, some of the characteristics we learned in the knee. So these muscles are the four muscles, the only muscles where I could also ask you for not just the insertion, but I could ask you for the insertion pathway. And if I ask you for the insertion pathway, then, and I think it was Amanda who said it out loud, then you would give me all of those things. You would tell me that it's the quadriceps tendon, or you could also, if you remember, call this the patella tendon. Either of those would be fine, which goes into the patella, which then forms the patellar ligament, which then attaches to the tibial tuberosity.
If he asks us for the insertion, we do say that. Will that be wrong?
It would not be wrong. No, I would not mark it wrong. But if
Okay.
I ask you for the insertion pathway and you just give me tibial tuberosity, that will be wrong.
Okay.
Again, just give me the information that I'm asking for. So notice we have the quadricep tendon that comes into the patella ligament into the tibial tuberosity. So it's a little bit more elaborate, but the good news is this is the only insertion pathway I'm going to ask you for. So if on a lab exam, you see the question reads, identify the insertion pathway, do you even really need to look at the picture?
No.
No. And does it matter which one of the four muscles I'm pointing at?
No.
No, the insertion pathway and the insertion is the same for all four of these. So that picture is now locked and loaded. Yes, so obviously, as you can see, because the quadriceps is your largest muscle group and because its tendon passes through the patella, absolutely, one of the things that can help to stabilize and strengthen the knee is to strengthen these muscles, absolutely. Not a random thought at all, absolutely true. And notice the hamstrings too, because they have the ability to basically shift and rotate and stabilize. They also play an important role in stabilizing the knee as well. All right, I'm going to cheat and leave this picture here because this is our insertion. This is our insertion pathway for all of them, so that makes it easy. So then all we have to do that's different is draw the origins. So let's start first with the rectus femoris. What is the origin of the rectus femoris?
Anterior, inferior iliac spine.
There you go. Anterior, inferior iliac spine. Remember, as we talked about, this is a muscle that is a bipennate muscle, a single tendon that goes straight down, hence the name rectus femoris. And then it has not one, but two rows of fascicles coming into it. And with these two rows of fascicles coming into it, we have many, many hands pulling on that one tendon. And so it produces an incredibly strong muscle, which is needed. Because our leg is a big, huge, ugly mass of meat. And to move it around through space requires a tremendous amount of strength. So we have this nice bipinnate muscle, massive amount of strength to move the leg. And in fact, how many joints does this rectus femoris cross?
2.
2, the hip and the knee. Being an anterior muscle, what is the obvious action on the hip?
Flexes.
Yep. Being an anterior muscle, what is the obvious action on the knee?
It extends.
Extends. And being a long, straight muscle, being straight, is it likely to twist and turn the leg?
No.
No.
No. In fact, its insertion pathway makes sure that it comes straight into the lower leg. So there's no twisting going on. So just 2 actions. All right. This is that high kick. Extend the knee, flex the hip. All right. So this is your rocket move. All right. Now, while we have this drawn here, what is the origin of the vastus intermedius?
The anterolateral surface of the femur.
Yeah. Oops, that didn't work. And notice it is also going to go straight into the knee. Notice it basically sits directly under the rectus femoris. So even in our bodybuilders, no matter how big that vastus intermedius gets, is it ever going to be seen? Are we ever going to be able to see it on our bodybuilders?
No.
No. In fact, notice if we go back to our picture from the book, notice the only way to see that vastus intermedius is to cut the rectus femoris. If we cut the rectus femoris, then and only then can we see the vastus intermedius underneath. The same thing is true for our model pictures. Right here, oh, great view. Notice here we clearly see that bipinnate shape of the rectus femoris. But the only way we'd be able to see the vastus intermedius is if we remove this muscle. It would be deep underneath it. So we would have to remove that muscle to be able to see it underneath. All right. Now, oh, I've erased it, but let's go ahead and quickly draw it back again. Vastus intermedius, anterior lateral portion of the femur, inserts into the tibial tuberosity. Insertion pathway is the quadricep tendon into the patella, patella ligament into the tibial tuberosity. Unlike the rectus femoris, how many joints does the vastus intermedius cross?
1.
1. So what's its one and only one action?
Extend the knee.
Extend the knee. There you go. All right. Questions on those 2 muscles? All right. I'm going to cheat and use the same picture because I've already drawn the insertion and the insertion pathway. And let's do the origin of the vastus intermedius. Pardon me, vastus medialis. What is the origin of the vastus medialis?
The linear aspera.
Yeah, where's that? Isn't that on the back side of the leg? Backside of the femur?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what else?
The intracanteric line.
There you go. Which is on the anterior side. Notice this is considered an anterior muscle group because of the effect that it has on the knee. All its tendons come into the front of the body and go through the front of the knee. So it's considered an anterior muscle group. But notice, as its name indicates, and as we'll see from the pictures, it really is on the medial part of the leg. And we see that with its origin. Some of its origin is posterior and some of its origin is anterior. So what this muscle really does is it wraps around the medial part of the leg. It comes and wraps around the medial part of the leg, wraps and comes in to the insertion pathway. And the same thing is true for the vastus lateralis. Only instead of being on the medial side of the leg, what is the vastus lateralis on?
Lateral.
The lateral side of the leg. Notice it shares two of the origins. It also originates from the linea aspera. It also originates from the intertrochanteric line. But being a lateral muscle, not surprisingly, it also originates from the lateralmost point of the hip, which was what again?
Greater trochanter.
Greater trochanter. So this muscle also, oops, wraps around the leg on the lateral aspect of the leg and comes into the tendon. So these muscles really wrap around the leg. They cover the most of the surface of the leg, but because they come into the front with their tendon insertion pathway, they're considered anterior muscles. And while they cover massive portions of the femur, how many joints do they cross?
One.
One. And so how many actions do each of them have?
One.
And what is that one action that they both share?
Extend the knee.
Extending the knee. There you go. Notice we can see this really nicely in a couple ways. Notice here when we look at the illustration, again, notice we can see those, let's make this bigger. Those fascicles of the vastus medialis wrapping around the leg, the fascicles of the vastus lateralis wrapping around the legs from the side. Notice our models show this nicely as well. Again, here we saw the vastus, the rectus femoris. Notice here on the medial aspect of the leg, we can see that vastus medialis coming around the medial side into the knee. And on the lateral side, we see the same thing. Under the iliotibial band, we see the vastus lateralis coming in this way as well. Now, I do want to point out one thing, and let's go back to the illustration for this. Notice the vastus lateralis, because it starts up here on that greater trochanter. Notice its belly is higher on the leg than the vastus medialis. The vastus medialis belly is pretty much right next to the patella. This is really convenient because one of the things that happens with these muscles in our bodybuilders is that these muscles get really huge and kind of weird looking. But if we can find the patella, which is a bone, so does that get any bigger?
No.
No. Then right next to it, we can find that nice big belly. And what would this nice big belly be right next to the kneecap? What muscle is right next to the kneecap? It's one of the vastus muscles.
Medialis.
Yeah. And if this on the medial side is the vastus medialis, then what is this?
Vastus lateralis.
Vastus lateralis. Notice what's not in between them. What should be in between these two muscles but isn't?
The rectus femoris.
Rectus femoris. It turns out the rectus femoris is indeed here, but notice in our bodybuilder, it's much, much shorter. And we can actually see why. Notice as we look at this bodybuilder's leg, we can actually see that tendon in the center. Remember, this is a bipennate muscle. So notice as the muscle cells get bigger and the fascicles get bigger, this muscle gets wider and thicker. But does it get longer?
No.
No. So notice as the vastus intermedius gets bigger underneath it, it pushes the rectus femoris further away from the knee. So here it no longer goes all the way to the knee because it's been pushed up by the bigger muscles underneath it. But notice, even as big as these are, do we see the vastus intermedius underneath it?
No.
No. So we're still only seeing 3 muscles of the quadriceps from the surface. But these are muscles that are very easy to see and recognize on our bodybuilder's leg. All righty. Questions on that? Excellent. All right. This is the information that I wanted to cover for today. Hold on. Was this a question? Wait. Okay, great question. So notice that these 2 muscle groups, the hamstrings and the quadricep muscle groups, are both thigh muscles on the leg. However, notice also they have very different functions, right? The quadricep extends the knee and thanks to the rectus femoris can extend the hip, whereas the hamstrings are able to flex the knee and extend the hip. Did I say that right? Extends the knee, flexes the hip for the quadriceps, extends the hip, flexes the knee for the hamstrings. So they are different muscles. They do have same actions, but think of it this way. If all 20 of us got into the classroom, got into a gym, and we all lift the exact same amount of weight, the exact same number of times, would we all get the same amount of gain from doing those exact same exercises with the exact same weight?
No.
No. And the reason for that is there's some genetic diversity. We have different combinations of muscles in our muscle cells in our muscles, different numbers. Some people have more, some people have less. So there are people who are going to have more of an advantage doing one type of an activity versus another. So there may be some that have larger or more muscle cells in their hamstrings, so they're stronger with those types of exercises, and others that might have more or certain types of muscle cells in their quadriceps, and so may be more comfortable with those types, more dominant with those types of activities. So it really has to do more with genetic variation, right? Yes, if we all worked out in the gym, we would all get bigger. We'd all see gains, but we're not going to all see the same amount of gains, even if we did the same number of exercises the same number of times. And that's primarily driven genetically. So those differences are primarily genetic. However, can they be overcome? Can you train muscles if you're hamstring dominant? Can you train your quadriceps to be just as dominant and just as strong? Yes.
Yeah.
It will take longer. It may take more work, but yeah. And again, Usain Bolt, who's a world-class Olympic sprinter, can he decide tomorrow that he's going to run marathons? He could, but is he necessarily going to be an Olympic marathoner if tomorrow?
No.
No. With months and even years of training, could he become an Olympic marathoner?
Yeah.
Possibly, right? Maybe not. It depends a lot on his genetics, but it's possible, but it's not going to be tomorrow. It'll take time and it would take energy and it'll take work and effort, but it's possible he might get there. He might never get there. He may be genetically predetermined to be a sprinter. And so that's kind of what you see. How our muscles are distributed throughout the body do vary from person to person. So while the exercise is the same, your strength, availability, the shape of the joint, some joints genetically may be shaped in a way that make them more comfortable to do an exercise and more stable to do an exercise one way or another. All of those are things that could affect how much mass you could move with those muscle groups. So I would say that hopefully answers your question, Augustina. All right, excellent. Awesome questions today, guys. I really appreciate it. This was really, really great. Any other questions?
I do have a few that pertain to the trunk muscles.
Okay, sure. Shoot.
I was wondering if you can show like a model or something of the, let's see, what was it? The diaphragm and the levator ani, because we saw pictures in the book, but we didn't really see it anywhere else.
There is a model in the classroom that has the levator ani. I don't have a picture of it, so it isn't something that would be easy to see. Because again, it's deep, it's internal. So if we had, for instance, a pelvis, like a pelvis model, and that's what we actually have in the classroom. We have a pelvis model, and in that pelvis model, basically there is a muscle located down here in the inferior region, and it's got this big V-shaped portion of it. That is the levator ani. So it's the only thing in that region. So that makes it pretty obvious. I like this picture, although I'll come back to it in a second. So again, levator ani is that primary muscle, right, deep to the gluteus maximus in both males and females. The diaphragm we see nicely in this bell-shaped structure here, but notice if we go back to that deep torso view here, notice with the torso opened up, we can actually see that bell-shaped curved diaphragm here inside of the picture. And in fact, if you look at the pictures we have in the module, notice here, we can see inside of the torso, and this doesn't show it, but this portion right here is actually where the diaphragm would connect. So there is actually a chest plate, and on that chest plate, you can actually see the beginning of the diaphragm. This is basically where the diaphragm would sit. So we can't see the muscle, but we can actually see the indentation where the diaphragm would sit inside of this torso model. I don't think I have an abdominal muscle. Let's see what they have here. If we go to muscle system torso, so this is the torso model picture I was talking about, but this is, notice the anterior side where we can see the rectus abdominis, the external oblique, and its aponeurosis. Notice on this side, they peel it off so we can see the internal oblique. Let's see if they give us the inside view. No, that's the picture I have. No, they don't. Here's a nice chart. Chart does a nice job of showing the diaphragm in place, so that's pretty good there. And that's it. So yeah, no, if this picture, this model, if you're in the classroom, if you flip this around onto the backside, under the backside, you'll actually see that attached to the back of the ribs, you can see the curve-shaped diaphragm forming on the posterior side of this model. So again, there's not a view of it here, but that chart, I think, does an excellent job of showing it, right, where we clearly see it there. So that'd be a good place to see it, or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Excellent. Any other questions? All right, excellent. That is all I have for you guys today then. Study hard this weekend. Remember, this is your big weekend to study for the exam. So look over this material, study it hard. You have the lecture slides, so you know what we're going to be going over on Monday. So there's no reason you can't look at it ahead of time. So Monday isn't the first time you're getting that information, 2 days before the exam. All right. Have a good weekend. Study hard. Remember, I have office hours right after class if you have any more questions, or tomorrow before my 431 class, or send emails. I can always respond to that this weekend. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Monday. Have a
Thank
good
you.
weekend. Be safe. Have fun.
Thank
Thank
you.
You
you.
too.